KaraokeBooks.
The Suicide Club. Written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Introduction by Daniel Pratt.
Introduction. Robert Louis Stevenson is best known for his The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and his two novels that would now be classified as young adult literature, Treasure Island and Kidnapped. The Scottish author had an uncanny talent for both adventure tales and character development, a combination so rare in literary history. His Long John Silver remains the archetype of the kindly pirate, including Captain Jack Sparrow of the immensely popular Pirates of the Caribbean movie series. Stevenson was a sickly man, and even as a child he spent much of his time in bed. These hours were not wasted, however, as the young man read voraciously and developed a keen sense of literary style. Stevenson went on to study law as a backup to his literary career, and he soon began to publish essays, short stories, and poems in various journals. Despite his poor health, Stevenson also traveled widely, enjoying a rather bohemian life of the late Victorian world. The Suicide Club was first published in London Magazine in 1878 and later in his first collection of stories New Arabian Nights. It introduces Stevenson's detective, Prince Florizel of Bohemia, a reference to Shakespeare's play A Winter's Tale, and his companion Colonel Geraldine. The three stories in this collection revolve around Florizel's infiltration of the underground Suicide Club, an institution for desperate men who want to end their lives but fear the consequences of suicide for their family and friends. Each part has its own mystery, and only in the last story does Florizel finally append the treacherous group. Written 9 years before the first Sherlock Holmes story, Stevenson helped to build the burgeoning detective genre in English. Although Florizel is not as well known today as Arthur Conan Doyle's creation, the contemporary genre owes as much to Stevenson as it does to Doyle himself.
Story of the young man with the cream tarts. During his residence in London, the accomplished Prince Florizel of Bohemia gained the affection of all classes by the seduction of his manner and by a well-considered generosity. He was a remarkable man even by what was known of him, and that was but a small part of what he actually did. Although of a placid temper in ordinary circumstances, and accustomed to take the world with as much philosophy as any ploughman, the Prince of Bohemia was not without a taste for ways of life more adventurous and eccentric than that to which he was destined by his birth. Now and then, when he fell into a low humor, when there was no laughable play to witness in any of the London theatres, and when the season of the year was unsuitable to those field sports in which he excelled all competitors, he would summon his confidant and master of the horse, Colonel Geraldine, and bid him prepare himself against an evening ramble. The master of the horse was a young officer of a brave and even temerarious disposition. He greeted the news with delight, and hastened to make ready. Long practice and a varied acquaintance of life had given him a singular facility in disguise. He could adapt not only his face and bearing, but his voice and almost his thoughts, to those of any rank, character, or nation. And in this way he diverted attention from the prince, and sometimes gained admission for the pair into strange societies. The civil authorities were never taken into the secret of these adventures. The imperturbable courage of the one and the ready invention and chivalrous devotion of the other had brought them through a score of dangerous passes, and they grew in confidence as time went on. One evening in March they were driven by a sharp fall of sleet into an oyster bar in the immediate neighbourhood of Leicester Square. Colonel Geraldine was dressed and painted to represent a person connected with the press in reduced circumstances, while the prince had, as usual, travestied his appearance by the addition of false whiskers and a pair of large adhesive eyebrows. These lent him a shaggy and weather-beaten air, which, for one of his urbanity, formed the most impenetrable disguise. Thus equipped, the commander and his satellite sipped their brandy and soda in security. The bar was full of guests, male and female, But though more than one of these offered to fall into talk with our adventurers, none of them promised to grow interesting upon a nearer acquaintance. There was nothing present but the lees of London and the commonplace of disrespectability, and the prince had already fallen to yawning, and was beginning to grow weary of the whole excursion, when the swing doors were pushed violently open, and a young man, followed by a couple of commissionaires, entered the bar. Each of the commissionaires carried a large dish of cream tarts under a cover, which they at once removed, and the young man made the round of the company, and pressed these confections upon every one's acceptance with an exaggerated courtesy. Sometimes his offer was laughingly accepted, sometimes it was firmly, or even harshly, rejected. In these latter cases the newcomer always ate the tart himself, with some more or less humorous commentary. At last he accosted Prince Florizel. "Sir," said he, with a profound obeisance, proffering the tart at the same time between his thumb and forefinger, "will you so far honor an entire stranger? I can answer for the quality of the pastry, having eaten 23 of them myself since 5 o'clock. I am in the habit," replied the prince, "of looking not so much to the nature of a gift as to the spirit in which it is offered." "The spirit, sir," returned the young man, with another bow, "is one of mockery." "Mockery?" repeated Florizel. "And whom do you propose to mock?" "I am not here to expound my philosophy," replied the other, "but to distribute these cream tarts. If I mention that I heartily include myself in the ridicule of the transaction, I hope you will consider honor satisfied and condescend. If not, you will constrain me to eat my 28th, and I own to being weary of the exercise." "You touch me," said the prince, "and I have all the will in the world to rescue you from this dilemma, but upon one condition. If my friend and I eat your cakes, for which we have neither of us any natural inclination, we shall expect you to join us at supper by way of recompense." The young man seemed to reflect. "I have still several dozen upon hand," he said at last, "and that will make it necessary for me to visit several more bars before my great affair is concluded. This will take some time, and if you are hungry—" The prince interrupted him with a polite gesture. "My friend and I will accompany you," he said, "for we have already a deep interest in your very agreeable mode of passing an evening. And now that the preliminaries of peace are settled, allow me to sign the treaty for both." And the prince swallowed the tart with the best grace imaginable. "It is delicious," said he. "I perceive you are a connoisseur," replied the young man. Colonel Geraldine likewise did honor to the pastry, and every one in that bar having now either accepted or refused his delicacies, the young man with the cream tarts led the way to another and similar establishment. The two commissionaires, who seemed to have grown accustomed to their absurd employment, followed immediately after, and the prince and the colonel brought up the rear, arm in arm, and smiling to each other as they went. In this order the company visited 2 other taverns, where scenes were enacted of a like nature to that already described, some refusing, some accepting, the favors of this vagabond hospitality, and the young man himself eating each rejected tart. On leaving the 3rd saloon the young man counted his store. There were but 9 remaining, 3 in one tray and 6 in the other. "Gentlemen," said he, addressing himself to his 2 new followers, "I am unwilling to delay your supper. I am positively sure you must be hungry. I feel that I owe you a special consideration. And on this great day for me, when I am closing a career of folly by my most conspicuously silly action, I wish to behave handsomely to all who give me countenance. Gentlemen, you shall wait no longer. Although my constitution is shattered by previous excesses, at the risk of my life I liquidate the suspensory condition." With these words he crushed the 9 remaining tarts into his mouth, and swallowed them at a single movement each. Then, turning to the commissionaires, he gave them a couple of sovereigns. "I have to thank you," said B., "for your extraordinary patience." And he dismissed them with a bow apiece. For some seconds he stood looking at the purse from which he had just paid his assistance. Then, with a laugh, he tossed it into the middle of the street, and signified his readiness for supper. In a small French restaurant in Soho, which had enjoyed an exaggerated reputation for some little while, but had already begun to be forgotten, and in a private room up 2 pair of stairs, the 3 companions made a very elegant supper, and drank 3 or 4 bottles of champagne, talking the while upon indifferent subjects. The young man was fluent and gay, but he laughed louder than was natural in a person of polite breeding. His hands trembled violently, and his voice took sudden and surprising inflections, which seemed to be independent of his will. The dessert had been cleared away, and all 3 had lighted their cigars, when the prince addressed him in these words. "You will, I am sure, pardon my curiosity. What I have seen of you has greatly pleased but even more puzzled me. And though I should be loath to seem indiscreet, I must tell you that my friend and I are persons very well worthy to be entrusted with a secret. We have many of our own, which we are continually revealing to improper ears. And if, as I suppose, your story is a silly one, you need have no delicacy with us, who are 2 of the silliest men in England. My name is Goddle, Theophilus Goddle. My friend is Major Alfred Hammersmith, or at least, such is the name by which he chooses to be known. We pass our lives entirely in the search for extravagant adventures, and there is no extravagance with which we are not capable of sympathy. I like you, Mr. Goddle, returned the young man. You inspire me with a natural confidence, and I have not the slightest objection to your friend the Major, whom I take to be a nobleman in masquerade. At least, I am sure he is no soldier." The colonel smiled at this compliment to the perfection of his art, and the young man went on in a more animated manner. "There is every reason why I should not tell you my story. Perhaps that is just the reason why I am going to do so. At least, you seem so well prepared to hear a tale of silliness that I cannot find it in my heart to disappoint you. My name, in spite of your example, I shall keep to myself. My age is not essential to the narrative. I am descended from my ancestors by ordinary generation, and from them I inherited the very eligible human tenement which I still occupy and a fortune of £300 a year. I suppose they also handed on to me a harebrained humor, which it has been my chief delight to indulge. I received a good education. I can play the violin nearly well enough to earn money in the orchestra of a penny gaff, but not quite. The same remark applies to the flute and the French horn. I learned enough of whist to lose about 100 a year at that scientific game. My acquaintance with French was sufficient to enable me to squander money in Paris with almost the same facility as in London. In short, I am a person full of manly accomplishments. I have had every sort of adventure, including a duel about nothing. Only 2 months ago I met a young lady exactly suited to my taste in mind and body. I found my heart melt. I saw that I had come upon my fate at last, and was in the way to fall in love. But when I came to reckon up what remained to me of my capital, I found it amounted to something less than £400. I ask you fairly, can a man who respects himself fall in love on £400? I concluded, certainly not. Left the presence of my charmer, and slightly accelerating my usual rate of expenditure, came this morning to my last £80. This I divided into 2 equal parts. 40 I reserved for a particular purpose, the remaining 40 I was to dissipate before the night. I have passed a very entertaining day, and played many farces besides that of the cream tarts which procured me the advantage of your acquaintance. For I was determined, as I told you, to bring a foolish career to a still more foolish conclusion. And when you saw me throw my purse into the street, the £40 were at an end. Now you know me as well as I know myself. A fool, but consistent in his folly, and, as I will ask you to believe, neither a whimperer nor a coward. From the whole tone of the young man's statement it was plain that he harbored very bitter and contemptuous thoughts about himself. His auditors were led to imagine that his love affair was nearer his heart than he admitted, and that he had a design on his own life. The farce of the cream tarts began to have very much the air of a tragedy in disguise. "Why, is this not odd?" broke out Geraldine, giving a look to Prince Florizel, "that we three fellows should have met by the merest accident in so large a wilderness as London, and should be so nearly in the same condition?" "How?" cried the young man. "Are you, too, ruined? Is this supper a folly like my cream tarts? Has the devil brought three of his own together for a last carouse? The devil, depend upon it, can sometimes do a very gentlemanly thing," returned Prince Florizel, "and I am so much touched by this coincidence, that, although we are not entirely in the same case, I am going to put an end to the disparity. Let your heroic treatment of the last cream tarts be my example." So saying, the prince drew out his purse and took from it a small bundle of banknotes. "You see, I was a week or so behind you, but I mean to catch you up and come neck and neck into the winning post," he continued. "This," laying one of the notes upon the table, "will suffice for the bill. As for the rest—" He tossed them into the fire, and they went up the chimney in a single blaze. The young man tried to catch his arm, but as the table was between them his interference came too late. "Unhappy man," he cried, "you should not have burned them all. You should have kept £40. £40, repeated the prince. "Why, in heaven's name, £40? Why not 80? Cried the colonel. "For to my certain knowledge there must have been 100 in the bundle." "It was only £40 he needed," said the young man gloomily. "But without them there is no admission. The rule is strict. £40 for each. Accursed life, where a man cannot even die without money." The prince and the colonel exchanged glances. "Explain yourself," said the latter. "I have still a pocket-book tolerably well lined, and I need not say how readily I should share my wealth with Goddle. But I must know to what end. You must certainly tell us what you mean." The young man seemed to awaken. He looked uneasily from one to the other, and his face flushed deeply. "You are not fooling me?" he asked. "You are indeed ruined men like me?" "Indeed, I am for my part," replied the colonel. "And for mine," said the prince, "I have given you proof. Who but a ruined man would throw his notes into the fire? The action speaks for itself." "A ruined man?" "Yes," returned the other suspiciously, "or else a millionaire." "Enough, sir," said the prince. "I have said so, and I am not accustomed to have my word remain in doubt." "Ruined?" said the young man. "Are you ruined, like me? Are you, after a life of indulgence, come to such a pass that you can only indulge yourself in one thing more? Are you," he kept lowering his voice as he went on, "are you going to give yourselves that last indulgence? Are you going to avoid the consequences of your folly by the one infallible and easy path? Are you going to give the slip to the sheriff's officers of conscience by the one open door?" Suddenly he broke off and attempted to laugh. "Here is your health," he cried, emptying his glass, "and good night to you, my merry ruined men." Colonel Geraldine caught him by the arm as he was about to rise. "You lack confidence in us," he said, "and you are wrong. To all your questions I make answer in the affirmative. But I am not so timid, and can speak the Queen's English plainly. We too, like yourself, have had enough of life, and are determined to die. Sooner or later, alone or together, we meant to seek out death and beard him where he lies ready. Since we have met you, and your case is more pressing, let it be tonight, and at once, and, if you will, all three together. Such a penniless trio," he cried, "should go arm in arm into the halls of Pluto, and give each other some countenance among the shades." Geraldine had hit exactly on the manners and intonations that became the part he was playing. The prince himself was disturbed, and looked over at his confidant with a shade of doubt. As for the young man, the flush came back darkly into his cheek, and his eyes threw out a spark of light. You are the men for me, he cried, with an almost terrible gaiety. Shake hands upon the bargain. His hand was cold and wet. You little know in what a company you will begin the march. You little know in what a happy moment for yourselves you partook of my cream tarts. I am only a unit, but I am a unit in an army. I know death's private door. I am one of his familiars, and can show you into eternity without ceremony and yet without scandal. They called upon him eagerly to explain his meaning. Can you muster 80 pounds between you? He demanded. Geraldine ostentatiously consulted his pocketbook, and replied in the affirmative. Fortunate beings, cried the young man. 40 pounds is the entry money of the Suicide Club. The Suicide Club, said the prince. Why, what the devil is that? Listen, said the young man. This is the age of conveniences, and I have to tell you of the last perfection of the sort. We have affairs in different places, and hence railways were invented. Railways separated us infallibly from our friends, and so telegraphs were made that we might communicate speedier at great distances. Even in hotels we have lifts to spare us a climb of some 100 steps. Now, we know that life is only a stage to play the fool upon as long as the part amuses us. There was one more convenience lacking to modern comfort. A decent, easy way to quit that stage. The back stairs to liberty, or, as I said this moment, death's private door. This, my two fellow rebels, is supplied by the Suicide Club. Do not suppose that you and I are alone, or even exceptional in the highly reasonable desire that we profess. A large number of our fellowmen, who have grown heartily sick of the performance in which they are expected to join daily and all their lives long, are only kept from flight by one or two considerations. Some have families who would be shocked, or even blamed, if the matter became public. Others have a weakness at heart and recoil from the circumstances of death. That is, to some extent, my own experience. I cannot put a pistol to my head and draw the trigger, for something stronger than myself withholds the act, and although I loathe life, I have not strength enough in my body to take hold of death and be done with it. For such as I, and for all who desire to be out of the coil without posthumous scandal, the Suicide Club has been inaugurated. How this has been managed, what is its history, or what may be its ramifications in other lands, I am myself uninformed, and what I know of its constitution, I am not at liberty to communicate to you. To this extent, however, I am at your service. If you are truly tired of life, I will introduce you tonight to a meeting, and if not tonight, at least some time within the week, you will be easily relieved of your existences. It is now, consulting his watch, 11. By past, at latest, we must leave this place, so that you have half an hour before you to consider my proposal. It is more serious than a cream tart, he added, with a smile, and I suspect more palatable. More serious, certainly, returned Colonel Geraldine, and as it is so much more so, will you allow me 5 minutes' speech in private with my friend, Mr. Goddle? It is only fair, answered the young man. If you will permit, I will retire. You will be very obliging, said the colonel. As soon as the two were alone. What, said Prince Florizel, is the use of this confabulation, Geraldine? I see you are flurried, whereas my mind is very tranquilly made up. I will see the end of this. Your Highness, said the colonel, turning pale, let me ask you to consider the importance of your life, not only to your friends, but to the public interest. If not tonight, said this madman, but supposing that tonight some irreparable disaster were to overtake your Highness's person, what, let me ask you, what would be my despair, and what the concern and disaster of a great nation? I will see the end of this, repeated the prince in his most deliberate tones, and have the kindness, Colonel Geraldine, to remember and respect your word of honor as a gentleman. Under no circumstances, recollect, nor without my special authority, are you to betray the incognito under which I choose to go abroad. These were my commands, which I now reiterate. And now," he added, "let me ask you to call for the bill." Colonel Geraldine bowed in submission. But he had a very white face as he summoned the young man of the cream tarts, and issued his directions to the waiter. The prince preserved his undisturbed demeanor, and described a Palais Royal farce to the young suicide with great humor and gusto. He avoided the colonel's appealing looks without ostentation, and selected another cheroot with more than usual care. Indeed, he was now the only man of the party who kept any command over his nerves. The bill was discharged, the prince giving the whole change of the note to the astonished waiter, and the three drove off in a four-wheeler. They were not long upon the way before the cab stopped at the entrance to a rather dark court. Here all descended. After Geraldine had paid the fare, the young man turned, and addressed Prince Florizel as follows. "It is still time, Mr. Goddle, to make good your escape into thraldom. And for you too, Major Hammersmith. Reflect well before you take another step, and if your hearts say no, here are the cross-roads." "Lead on, sir," said the prince. "I am not the man to go back from a thing once said." "Your coolness does me good," replied their guide. "I have never seen any one so unmoved at this conjuncture, and yet you are not the first whom I have escorted to this door. More than one of my friends has preceded me, where I knew I must shortly follow. But this is of no interest to you. Wait me here for only a few moments. I shall return as soon as I have arranged the preliminaries of your introduction." And with that the young man, waving his hand to his companions, turned into the court, entered a doorway and disappeared. "Of all our follies," said Colonel Geraldine in a low voice, "this is the wildest and most dangerous." "I perfectly believe so," returned the prince. "We have still," pursued the colonel, "a moment to ourselves. Let me beseech your highness to profit by the opportunity and retire. The consequences of this step are so dark, and may be so grave, that I feel myself justified in pushing a little farther than usual the liberty which your highness is so condescending as to allow me in private." "Am I to understand that Colonel Geraldine is afraid?" asked his highness, taking his cheroot from his lips, and looking keenly into the other's face. "My fear is certainly not personal," replied the other proudly. "Of that your highness may rest well assured." "I had supposed as much," returned the prince, with undisturbed good humor, "but I was unwilling to remind you of the difference in our stations. No more, no more," he added, seeing Geraldine about to apologize, "you stand excused." And he smoked placidly, leaning against a railing, until the young man returned. "Well," he asked, "has our reception been arranged?" "Follow me," was the reply. "The president will see you in the cabinet. And let me warn you to be frank in your answers. I have stood your guarantee, but the club requires a searching inquiry before admission, for the indiscretion of a single member would lead to the dispersion of the whole society forever." The prince and Geraldine put their heads together for a moment. "Bear me out in this," said the one, and "bear me out in that," said the other, and by boldly taking up the characters of men with whom both were acquainted, they had come to an agreement in a twinkling, and were ready to follow their guide into the president's cabinet. There were no formidable obstacles to pass. The outer door stood open. The door of the cabinet was ajar, and there, in a small but very high apartment, the young man left them once more. "He will be here immediately," he said, with a nod, as he disappeared. Voices were audible in the cabinet through the folding doors which formed one end, and now and then the noise of a champagne cork, followed by a burst of laughter, intervened among the sounds of conversation. A single tall window looked out upon the river and the embankment, and by the disposition of the lights they judged themselves not far from Charing Cross Station. The furniture was scanty, and the coverings worn to the thread, and there was nothing movable except a handbell in the center of a round table, and the hats and coats of a considerable party hung round the wall on pegs. "What sort of a den is this?" said Geraldine. "That is what I have come to see," replied the prince. "If they keep live devils on the premises, the thing may grow amusing." Just then the folding door was opened no more than was necessary for the passage of a human body, and there entered at the same moment a louder buzz of talk, and the redoubtable president of the Suicide Club. The president was a man of 50 or upwards, large and rambling in his gait, with shaggy side whiskers, a bald top to his head, and a veiled grey eye, which now and then emitted a twinkle. His mouth, which embraced a large cigar, he kept continually screwing round and from side to side, as he looked sagaciously and coldly at the strangers. He was dressed in light tweeds, with his neck very open in a striped shirt collar, and carried a minute book under one arm. "Good evening," said he, after he had closed the door behind him. "I am told you wish to speak with me." "We have a desire, sir, to join the Suicide Club," replied the colonel. The president rolled his cigar about in his mouth. "What is that?" he said abruptly. "Pardon me," returned the colonel, "but I believe you are the person best qualified to give us information on that point." "I?" cried the president. "A suicide club? Come, come. This is a frolic for all Fools' Day. I can make allowances for gentlemen who get merry in their liquor, but let there be an end to this. Call your club what you will," said the colonel, "you have some company behind these doors, and we insist on joining it." "Sir," returned the president curtly, "you have made a mistake. This is a private house, and you must leave it instantly." The prince had remained quietly in his seat throughout this little colloquy. But now, when the colonel looked over to him, as much as to say, "Take your answer and come away, for God's sake," he drew his cheroot from his mouth, and spoke. "I have come here," said he, "upon the invitation of a friend of yours. He has doubtless informed you of my intention in thus intruding on your party. Let me remind you that a person in my circumstances has exceedingly little to bind him, and is not at all likely to tolerate much rudeness. I am a very quiet man, as a usual thing. But, my dear sir, you are either going to oblige me in the little matter of which you are aware, or you shall very bitterly repent that you ever admitted me to your ante-chamber." The president laughed aloud. "That is the way to speak," said he. "You are a man who is a man. You know the way to my heart, and can do what you like with me. Will you," he continued, addressing Geraldine, "will you step aside for a few minutes? I shall finish first with your companion, and some of the club's formalities require to be fulfilled in private." With these words he opened the door of a small closet, into which he shut the colonel. "I believe in you," he said to Florizel, as soon as they were alone, "but are you sure of your friend?" "Not so sure as I am of myself, though he has more cogent reasons," answered Florizel, "but sure enough to bring him here without alarm. He has had enough to cure the most tenacious man of life. He was cashiered the other day for cheating at cards." "A good reason, I dare say," replied the president. "At least, we have another in the same case, and I feel sure of him." "Have you also been in the service, may I ask?" "I have," was the reply. "But I was too lazy, I left it early." "What is your reason for being tired of life?" pursued the president. "The same, as near as I can make out," answered the prince. "Unadulterated laziness." The president started. "D.N. it," said he, "you must have something better than that." "I have no more money," added Florizel. "That is also a vexation, without doubt. It brings my sense of idleness to an acute point." The president rolled his cigar round in his mouth for some seconds, directing his gaze straight into the eyes of this unusual neophyte. But the prince supported his scrutiny with unabashed good temper. "If I had not a deal of experience," said the president at last, "I should turn you off. But I know the world. And this much anyway, that the most frivolous excuses for a suicide are often the toughest to stand by. And when I downright like a man, as I do you, sir, I would rather strain the regulation than deny him." The prince and the colonel, one after the other, were subjected to a long and particular interrogatory. The prince alone, but Geraldine in the presence of the prince, so that the president might observe the countenance of the one while the other was being warmly cross-examined. The result was satisfactory, and the president, after having booked a few details of each case, produced a form of oath to be accepted. Nothing could be conceived more passive than the obedience promised, or more stringent than the terms by which the juror bound himself. The man who forfeited a pledge so awful could scarcely have a rag of honor or any of the consolations of religion left to him. Florizel signed the document, but not without a shudder. The colonel followed his example with an air of great depression. Then the president received the entry money, and without more ado, introduced the two friends into the smoking room of the Suicide Club. The smoking room of the Suicide Club was the same height as the cabinet into which it opened, but much larger, and papered from top to bottom with an imitation of oak wainscot. A large and cheerful fire and a number of gas jets illuminated the company. The prince and his follower made the number up to 18. Most of the party were smoking, and drinking champagne. A feverish hilarity reigned, with sudden and rather ghastly pauses. "Is this a full meeting?" asked the prince. "Middling," said the president. "By the way," he added, "if you have any money, it is usual to offer some champagne. It keeps up a good spirit, and is one of my own little perquisites." "Hammersmith," said Florizel, "I may leave the champagne to you." And with that he turned away and began to go round among the guests. Accustomed to play the host in the highest circles, he charmed and dominated all whom he approached. There was something at once winning and authoritative in his address, and his extraordinary coolness gave him yet another distinction in this half-maniacal society. As he went from one to another he kept both his eyes and ears open, and soon began to gain a general idea of the people among whom he found himself. As in all other places of resort, one type predominated: people in the prime of youth, with every show of intelligence and sensibility in their appearance, but with little promise of strength or the quality that makes success. Few were much above 30, and not a few were still in their teens. They stood, leaning on tables and shifting on their feet. Sometimes they smoked extraordinarily fast, and sometimes they let their cigars go out. Some talked well, but the conversation of others was plainly the result of nervous tension, and was equally without wit or purport. As each new bottle of champagne was opened, there was a manifest improvement in gaiety. Only two were seated, one in a chair in the recess of the window, with his head hanging and his hands plunged deep into his trouser pockets, pale, visibly moist with perspiration, saying never a word, a very wreck of soul and body. The other sat on the divan close by the chimney, and attracted notice by a trenchant dissimilarity from all the rest. He was probably upwards of 40, but he looked fully 10 years older, and Florizel thought he had never seen a man more naturally hideous, nor one more ravaged by disease and ruinous excitements. He was no more than skin and bone, was partly paralyzed, and wore spectacles of such unusual power, that his eyes appeared through the glasses greatly magnified and distorted in shape. Except the prince and the president, he was the only person in the room who preserved the composure of ordinary life. There was little decency among the members of the club. Some boasted of the disgraceful actions, the consequences of which had reduced them to seek refuge in death, and the others listened without disapproval. There was a tacit understanding against moral judgments, and whoever passed the club doors enjoyed already some of the immunities of the tomb. They drank to each other's memories, and to those of notable suicides in the past. They compared and developed their different views of death, some declaring that it was no more than blackness and cessation, others full of a hope that that very night they should be scaling the stars and commencing with the mighty dead. To the eternal memory of Baron Trenck, the type of suicides, cried one. He went out of a small cell into a smaller, that he might come forth again to freedom. For my part, said a second, I wish no more than a bandage for my eyes and cotton for my ears. Only they have no cotton thick enough in this world. A third was for reading the mysteries of life in a future state, and a fourth professed that he would never have joined the club, if he had not been induced to believe in Mr. Darwin. I could not bear, said this remarkable suicide, to be descended from an ape. Altogether, the prince was disappointed by the bearing and conversation of the members. It does not seem to me, he thought, a matter for so much disturbance. If a man has made up his mind to kill himself, let him do it, in God's name, like a gentleman. This flutter and big talk is out of place. In the meanwhile Colonel Geraldine was a prey to the blackest apprehensions. The club and its rules were still a mystery, and he looked round the room for someone who should be able to set his mind at rest. In this survey his eye lighted on the paralytic person with the strong spectacles, and seeing him so exceedingly tranquil, he besought the president, who was going in and out of the room under a pressure of business, to present him to the gentleman on the divan. The functionary explained the needlessness of all such formalities within the club, but nevertheless presented Mr. Hammersmith to Mr. Malthus. Mr. Malthus looked at the colonel curiously, and then requested him to take a seat upon his right. "You are a newcomer," he said, "and wish information? You have come to the proper source. It is 2 years since I first visited this charming club." The colonel breathed again. If Mr. Malthus had frequented the place for 2 years there could be little danger for the prince in a single evening. But Geraldine was none the less astonished, and began to suspect a mystification. "What?" cried he, 2 years. "I thought, but indeed I see I have been made the subject of a pleasantry." "By no means," replied Mr. Malthus mildly. "My case is peculiar. I am not, properly speaking, a suicide at all, but, as it were, an honorary member. I rarely visit the club twice in 2 months. My infirmity and the kindness of the president have procured me these little immunities, for which besides I pay at an advanced rate. Even as it is my luck has been extraordinary. I am afraid," said the colonel, "that I must ask you to be more explicit. You must remember that I am still most imperfectly acquainted with the rules of the club. An ordinary member who comes here in search of death like yourself," replied the paralytic, "returns every evening until fortune favors him. He can even, if he is penniless, get board and lodging from the president. Very fair, I believe, and clean, although, of course, not luxurious. That could hardly be, considering the exiguity, if I may so express myself, of the subscription. And then the president's company is a delicacy in itself." "Indeed," cried Geraldine, "he had not greatly prepossessed me." "Ah," said Mr. Malthus, "you do not know the man, the drollest fellow. What stories! What cynicism! He knows life to admiration and, between ourselves, is probably the most corrupt rogue in Christendom. And he also," asked the colonel, "is a permanency, like yourself, if I may say so without offense?" "Indeed, he is a permanency in a very different sense from me," replied Mr. Malthus. "I have him graciously spared, but I must go at last. Now he never plays. He shuffles and deals for the club, and makes the necessary arrangements. That man, my dear Mr. Hammersmith, is the very soul of ingenuity. For 3 years he has pursued in London his useful and, I think I may add, his artistic calling, and not so much as a whisper of suspicion has been once aroused. I believe him myself to be inspired. You doubtless remember the celebrated case, 6 months ago, of the gentleman who was accidentally poisoned in a chemist's shop? That was one of the least rich, one of the least racy, of his notions, but then, how simple! And how safe! You astound me," said the colonel. "Was that unfortunate gentleman one of the," he was about to say, "victims," but bethinking himself in time, he substituted, "members of the club?" In the same flash of thought, It occurred to him that Mr. Malthus himself had not at all spoken in the tone of one who is in love with death, and he added hurriedly, "But I perceive I am still in the dark. You speak of shuffling and dealing. Pray for what end? And since you seem rather unwilling to die than otherwise, I must own that I cannot conceive what brings you here at all." "You say truly that you are in the dark," replied Mr. Malthus with more animation. "Why, my dear sir, this club is the temple of intoxication. If my enfeebled health could support the excitement more often, you may depend upon it I should be more often here. It requires all the sense of duty engendered by a long habit of ill health and careful regimen, to keep me from excess in this, which is, I may say, my last dissipation. I have tried them all, sir," he went on, laying his hand on Geraldine's arm, "all without exception, and I declare to you, upon my honor, there is not one of them that has not been grossly and untruthfully overrated. People trifle with love. Now, I deny that love is a strong passion. Fear is the strong passion. It is with fear that you must trifle, if you wish to taste the intensest joys of living. Envy me, sir," he added with a chuckle, "I am a coward." Geraldine could scarcely repress a movement of repulsion for this deplorable wretch, but he commanded himself with an effort, and continued his inquiries. "How, sir," he asked, "is the excitement so artfully prolonged? And where is there any element of uncertainty?" "I must tell you how the victim for every evening is selected," returned Mr. Malthus, "and not only the victim, but another member, who is to be the instrument in the club's hands, and death's high priest for that occasion." "Good God!" said the colonel, "do they then kill each other?" "The trouble of suicide is removed in that way," returned Malthus with a nod. "Merciful heavens!" ejaculated the colonel, "and my friend I mean, may any of us be pitched upon this evening as the slayer of another man's body and immortal spirit? Can such things be possible among men born of women? Oh! Infamy of infamies!" He was about to rise in his horror, when he caught the prince's eye. It was fixed upon him from across the room with a frowning and angry stare. And in a moment Geraldine recovered his composure. "After all," he added, "why not? And since you say the game is interesting, vogue lagale, I follow the club." Mr. Malthus had keenly enjoyed the colonel's amazement and disgust. He had the vanity of wickedness, and it pleased him to see another man give way to a generous movement, while he felt himself, in his entire corruption, superior to such emotions. "You now, after your first moment of surprise," said he, "are in a position to appreciate the delights of our society. You can see how it combines the excitement of a gaming table, a duel, and a Roman amphitheater. The pagans did well enough. I cordially admire the refinement of their minds, but it has been reserved for a Christian country to attain this extreme, this quintessence, this absolute of poignancy. You will understand how vapid are all amusements to a man who has acquired a taste for this one. The game we play," he continued, "is one of extreme simplicity. A full pack, but I perceive you are about to see the thing in progress. Will you lend me the help of your arm? I am unfortunately paralyzed." Indeed, just as Mr. Malthus was beginning his description, another pair of folding doors was thrown open, and the whole club began to pass, not without some hurry, into the adjoining room. It was similar in every respect to the one from which it was entered, but somewhat differently furnished. The center was occupied by a long green table, at which the president sat shuffling a pack of cards with great particularity. Even with the stick and the colonel's arm, Mr. Malthus walked with so much difficulty that every one was seated before this pair, and the prince, who had waited for them, entered the apartment, and, in consequence, the three took seats close together at the lower end of the board. "It is a pack of 52, whispered Mr. Malthus. "Watch for the ace of spades, which is the sign of death, and the ace of clubs, which designates the official of the night. Happy, happy young men, he added. You have good eyes, and can follow the game. Alas! I cannot tell an ace from a deuce across the table. And he proceeded to equip himself with a second pair of spectacles. I must at least watch the faces, he explained. The colonel rapidly informed his friend of all that he had learned from the honorary member, and of the horrible alternative that lay before them. The prince was conscious of a deadly chill and a contraction about his heart. He swallowed with difficulty, and looked from side to side like a man in a maze. One bold stroke, whispered the colonel, and we may still escape. But the suggestion recalled the prince's spirits. Silence, said B. Let me see that you can play like a gentleman for any stake, however serious. And he looked about him, once more to all appearance at his ease, although his heart beat thickly, and he was conscious of an unpleasant heat in his bosom. The members were all very quiet and intent. Every one was pale, but none so pale as Mr. Malthus. His eyes protruded. His head kept nodding involuntarily upon his spine. His hands found their way, one after the other, to his mouth, where they made clutches at his tremulous and ashen lips. It was plain that the honorary member enjoyed his membership on very startling terms. Attention, gentlemen, said the president. And he began slowly dealing the cards about the table in the reverse direction, pausing until each man had shown his card. Nearly everyone hesitated, and sometimes you would see a player's fingers stumble more than once before he could turn over the momentous slip of pasteboard. As the prince's turn drew nearer, he was conscious of a growing and almost suffocating excitement. But he had somewhat of the gambler's nature, and recognized almost with astonishment that there was a degree of pleasure in his sensations. The 9 of clubs fell to his lot, the 3 of spades was dealt to Geraldine, and the Queen of hearts to Mr. Malthus, who was unable to suppress a sob of relief. The young man of the cream tarts almost immediately afterwards turned over the ace of clubs, and remained frozen with horror, the card still resting on his finger. He had not come there to kill, but to be killed. And the prince in his generous sympathy with his position almost forgot the peril that still hung over himself and his friend. The deal was coming round again, and still death's card had not come out. The players held their respiration, and only breathed by gasps. The prince received another club. Geraldine had a diamond. But when Mr. Malthus turned up his card, a horrible noise, like that of something breaking, issued from his mouth, and he rose from his seat and sat down again, with no sign of his paralysis. It was the ace of spades. The honorary member had trifled once too often with his terrors. Conversation broke out again almost at once. The players relaxed their rigid attitudes, and began to rise from the table and stroll back by 2s and 3s into the smoking room. The president stretched his arms and yawned, like a man who has finished his day's work. But Mr. Malthus sat in his place, with his head in his hands, and his hands upon the table, drunk and motionless, a thing stricken down. The prince and Geraldine made their escape at once. In the cold night air their horror of what they had witnessed was redoubled. Alas! cried the prince, to be bound by an oath in such a matter. To allow this wholesale trade in murder to be continued with profit and impunity. If I but dared to forfeit my pledge. That is impossible for your highness, replied the colonel, whose honor is the honor of Bohemia. But I dare, and may with propriety, forfeit mine. Geraldine, said the prince, if your honor suffers in any of the adventures into which you follow me, not only will I never pardon you, but, what I believe will much more sensibly affect you, I should never forgive myself. I receive your highness's commands, replied the colonel. Shall we go from this accursed spot? Yes, said the prince. Call a cab in heaven's name, and let me try to forget in slumber the memory of this night's disgrace. But it was notable that he carefully read the name of the court before he left it. The next morning, as soon as the prince was stirring, Colonel Geraldine brought him a daily newspaper, with the following paragraph marked, "Melancholy accident. This morning, about 2 o'clock, Mr. Bartholomew Malthus, of 16 Chepstow Place, Westbourne Grove, on his way home from a party at a friend's house, fell over the upper parapet in Trafalgar Square, fracturing his skull and breaking a leg and an arm. Death was instantaneous. Mr. Malthus, accompanied by a friend, was engaged in looking for a cab at the time of the unfortunate occurrence. As Mr. Malthus was paralytic, it is thought that his fall may have been occasioned by another seizure. The unhappy gentleman was well known in the most respectable circles, and his loss will be widely and deeply deplored. If ever a soul went straight to hell," said Geraldine solemnly, "it was that paralytic man's." The prince buried his face in his hands, and remained silent. "I am almost rejoiced," continued the colonel, "to know that he is dead. But for our young man of the cream tarts I confess my heart bleeds." "Geraldine," said the prince, raising his face, "that unhappy lad was last night as innocent as you and I, and this morning the guilt of blood is on his soul. When I think of the president, my heart grows sick within me. I do not know how it shall be done, but I shall have that scoundrel at my mercy as there is a God in heaven." What an experience, what a lesson, was that game of cards! "One," said the colonel, "never to be repeated." The prince remained so long without replying, that Geraldine grew alarmed. "You cannot mean to return," he said. "You have suffered too much and seen too much horror already. The duties of your high position forbid the repetition of the hazard." "There is much in what you say," replied Prince Florizel, "and I am not altogether pleased with my own determination. Alas! In the clothes of the greatest potentate, what is there but a man? I never felt my weakness more acutely than now, Geraldine, but it is stronger than I. Can I cease to interest myself in the fortunes of the unhappy young man who supped with us some hours ago? Can I leave the president to follow his nefarious career unwatched? Can I begin an adventure so entrancing, and not follow it to an end? No, Geraldine. You ask of the prince more than the man is able to perform. Tonight, once more, we take our places at the table of the Suicide Club." Colonel Geraldine fell upon his knees. "Will your highness take my life?" he cried. "It is his freely, but do not, oh do not. Let him ask me to countenance so terrible a risk." "Colonel Geraldine," replied the prince, with some haughtiness of manner, "your life is absolutely your own. I only looked for obedience, and when that is unwillingly rendered, I shall look for that no longer. I add one word: your importunity in this affair has been sufficient." The master of the horse regained his feet at once. "Your highness," he said, "may I be excused in my attendance this afternoon? I dare not, as an honorable man, venture a second time into that fatal house until I have perfectly ordered my affairs. Your highness shall meet, I promise him, with no more opposition from the most devoted and grateful of his servants." "My dear Geraldine," returned Prince Florizel, "I always regret when you oblige me to remember my rank. Dispose of your day as you think fit, but be here before 11 in the same disguise." The club, on this second evening, was not so fully attended, and when Geraldine and the prince arrived, there were not above half a dozen persons in the smoking room. His Highness took the president aside and congratulated him warmly on the demise of Mr. Malthus. "I like," he said, "to meet with capacity, and certainly find much of it in you. Your profession is of a very delicate nature, but I see you are well qualified to conduct it with success and secrecy." The president was somewhat affected by these compliments from one of His Highness's superior bearing. He acknowledged them almost with humility. "Poor Malthy," he added, "I shall hardly know the club without him. The most of my patrons are boys, sir, and poetical boys, who are not much company for me. Not but what Malthy had some poetry, too, but it was of a kind that I could understand. I can readily imagine you should find yourself in sympathy with Mr. Malthus, returned the prince. He struck me as a man of a very original disposition. The young man of the cream tarts was in the room, but painfully depressed and silent. His late companions sought in vain to lead him into conversation. How bitterly I wish, he cried, that I had never brought you to this infamous abode. Begone, while you are clean-handed. If you could have heard the old man scream as he fell, and the noise of his bones upon the pavement. Wish me, if you have any kindness to so fallen a being, wish the ace of spades for me tonight. A few more members dropped in as the evening went on, but the club did not muster more than the devil's dozen when they took their places at the table. The prince was again conscious of a certain joy in his alarms, but he was astonished to see Geraldine so much more self-possessed than on the night before. It is extraordinary, thought the prince, that a will, made or unmade, should so greatly influence a young man's spirit. Attention, gentlemen, said the president, and he began to deal. 3 times the cards went all round the table, and neither of the marked cards had yet fallen from his hand. The excitement as he began the 4th distribution was overwhelming. There were just cards enough to go once more entirely round. The prince, who sat second from the dealer's left, would receive, in the reverse mode of dealing practiced at the club, the second last card. The third player turned up a black ace, it was the ace of clubs. The next received a diamond, the next a heart, and so on, but the ace of spades was still undelivered. At last, Geraldine, who sat upon the prince's left, turned his card. It was an ace, but the ace of hearts. When Prince Florizel saw his fate upon the table in front of him, his heart stood still. He was a brave man, but the sweat poured off his face. There were exactly 50 chances out of 100 that he was doomed. He reversed the card. It was the ace of spades. A loud roaring filled his brain, and the table swam before his eyes. He heard the player on his right break into a fit of laughter that sounded between mirth and disappointment. He saw the company rapidly dispersing, but his mind was full of other thoughts. He recognized how foolish, how criminal, had been his conduct. In perfect health, in the prime of his years, the heir to a throne, he had gambled away his future and that of a brave and loyal country. God, he cried, God forgive me. And with that, the confusion of his senses passed away, and he regained his self-possession in a moment. To his surprise, Geraldine had disappeared. There was no one in the card room but his destined butcher consulting with the president, and the young man of the cream tarts, who slipped up to the prince, and whispered in his ear, I would give $1,000,000, if I had it, for your luck. His Highness could not help reflecting, as the young man departed, that he would have sold his opportunity for a much more moderate sum. The whispered conference now came to an end. The holder of the ace of clubs left the room with a look of intelligence, and the president, approaching the unfortunate prince, proffered him his hand. I am pleased to have met you, sir, said he, and pleased to have been in a position to do you this trifling service. At least, you cannot complain of delay. On the second evening, what a stroke of luck! The prince endeavored in vain to articulate something in response, but his mouth was dry and his tongue seemed paralyzed. You feel a little sickish? Asked the president, with some show of solicitude. Most gentlemen do. Will you take a little brandy? The prince signified in the affirmative, and the other immediately filled some of the spirit into a tumbler. Poor old Malthy! Ejaculated the president, as the prince drained the glass. He drank near upon a pint, and little enough good it seemed to do him. I am more amenable to treatment, said the prince, a good deal revived. I am my own man again at once, as you perceive. And so, let me ask you, what are my directions? You will proceed along the Strand in the direction of the city, and on the left-hand pavement, until you meet the gentleman who has just left the room. He will continue your instructions, and him you will have the kindness to obey. the authority of the club is vested in his person for the night. And now," added the president, "I wish you a pleasant walk." Florizel acknowledged the salutation rather awkwardly, and took his leave. He passed through the smoking room, where the bulk of the players were still consuming champagne, some of which he had himself ordered and paid for, and he was surprised to find himself cursing them in his heart. He put on his hat and greatcoat in the cabinet, and selected his umbrella from a corner. The familiarity of these acts, and the thought that he was about them for the last time, betrayed him into a fit of laughter which sounded unpleasantly in his own ears. He conceived a reluctance to leave the cabinet, and turned instead to the window. The sight of the lamps and the darkness recalled him to himself. "Come, come, I must be a man," he thought, "and tear myself away." At the corner of Box Court 3 men fell upon Prince Florizel and he was unceremoniously thrust into a carriage, which at once drove rapidly away. There was already an occupant. "Will your Highness pardon my zeal?" said a well-known voice. The prince threw himself upon the colonel's neck in a passion of relief. "How can I ever thank you?" he cried. And how was this effected? Although he had been willing to march upon his doom, he was overjoyed to yield to friendly violence, and return once more to life and hope. "You can thank me effectually enough," replied the colonel, "by avoiding all such dangers in the future. And as for your second question, all has been managed by the simplest means. I arranged this afternoon with a celebrated detective. Secrecy has been promised and paid for. Your own servants have been principally engaged in the affair. The house in Box Court has been surrounded since nightfall, and this, which is one of your own carriages, has been awaiting you for nearly an hour. And the miserable creature who was to have slain me, what of him?" inquired the prince. "He was pinioned as he left the club," replied the colonel, "and now awaits your sentence at the palace, where he will soon be joined by his accomplices." "Geraldine," said the prince, "you have saved me against my explicit orders, and you have done well. I owe you not only my life, but a lesson, and I should be unworthy of my rank if I did not show myself grateful to my teacher. Let it be yours to choose the manner." There was a pause, during which the carriage continued to speed through the streets, and the 2 men were each buried in his own reflections. The silence was broken by Colonel Geraldine. "Your Highness," said he, "has by this time a considerable body of prisoners. There is at least one criminal among the number to whom justice should be dealt. Our oath forbids us all recourse to law, and discretion would forbid it equally if the oath were loosened. May I inquire your Highness's intention?" "It is decided," answered Florizel. "The president must fall in duel. It only remains to choose his adversary." "Your Highness has permitted me to name my own recompense," said the colonel. "Will he permit me to ask the appointment of my brother? It is an honorable post, but I dare assure your Highness that the lad will acquit himself with credit." "You ask me an ungracious favor," said the prince, "but I must refuse you nothing." The colonel kissed his hand with the greatest affection, and at that moment the carriage rolled under the archway of the prince's splendid residence. An hour after, Florizel in his official robes, and covered with all the orders of Bohemia, received the members of the Suicide Club. "Foolish and wicked men," said he, "as many of you as have been driven into this strait by the lack of fortune shall receive employment and remuneration from my officers. Those who suffer under a sense of guilt must have recourse to a higher and more generous potentate than I. I feel pity for all of you, deeper than you can imagine. Tomorrow you shall tell me your stories, and as you answer more frankly, I shall be the more able to remedy your misfortunes. As for you," he added, turning to the president, "I should only offend a person of your parts by any offer of assistance, but I have instead a piece of diversion to propose to you. Here," laying his hand on the shoulder of Colonel Geraldine's young brother, "is an officer of mine who desires to make a little tour upon the continent, and I ask you, as a favor, to accompany him on this excursion. Do you," he went on, changing his tone, "do you shoot well with the pistol? Because you may have need of that accomplishment. When two men go traveling together, it is best to be prepared for all. Let me add that, if by any chance you should lose young Mr. Geraldine upon the way, I shall always have another member of my household to place at your disposal. And I am known, Mr. President, to have long eyesight, and as long an arm." With these words, said with much sternness, the prince concluded his address. Next morning the members of the club were suitably provided for by his munificence, and the president set forth upon his travels, under the supervision of Mr. Geraldine, and a pair of faithful and adroit lackeys, well trained in the prince's household. Not content with this, discreet agents were put in possession of the house in Box Court, and all letters or visitors for the Suicide Club or its officials were to be examined by Prince Florizel in person. Here, says my Arabian author, ends the story of the young man with the cream tarts, who is now a comfortable householder in Wigmore Street, Cavendish Square. The number, for obvious reasons, I suppress. Those who care to pursue the adventures of Prince Florizel and the president of the Suicide Club, may read the history of the physician and the Saratoga trunk.
KaraokeBooks.
Story of the Physician and the Saratoga Trunk. Mr. Slyus Q. Scudamore was a young American of a simple and harmless disposition, which was the more to his credit as he came from New England, a quarter of the New World not precisely famous for those qualities. Although he was exceedingly rich, he kept a note of all his expenses in a little paper pocket-book, and he had chosen to study the attractions of Paris from the seventh story of what is called a furnished hotel, in the Latin Quarter. There was a great deal of habit in his penuriousness, and his virtue, which was very remarkable among his associates, was principally founded upon diffidence and youth. The next room to his was inhabited by a lady, very attractive in her air and very elegant in toilette, whom, on his first arrival, he had taken for a countess. In course of time he had learned that she was known by the name of Madame Zephyrin, and that whatever station she occupied in life it was not that of a person of title. Madame Zephyrin, probably in the hope of enchanting the young American, used to flaunt by him on the stairs with a civil inclination, a word of course, and a knock-down look out of her black eyes, and disappear in a rustle of silk, and with the revelation of an admirable foot and ankle. But these advances, so far from encouraging Mr. Scudamore, plunged him into the depths of depression and bashfulness. She had come to him several times for a light, or to apologize for the imaginary depredations of her poodle, but his mouth was closed in the presence of so superior a being, his French promptly left him, and he could only stare and stammer until she was gone. The slenderness of their intercourse did not prevent him from throwing out insinuations of a very glorious order when he was safely alone with a few males. The room on the other side of the Americans, for there were 3 rooms on a floor in the hotel, was tenanted by an old English physician of rather doubtful reputation. Dr. Noel, for that was his name, had been forced to leave London, where he enjoyed a large and increasing practice, and it was hinted that the police had been the instigators of this change of scene. At least he, who had made something of a figure in earlier life, now dwelt in the Latin Quarter in great simplicity and solitude, and devoted much of his time to study. Mr. Scudamore had made his acquaintance, and the pair would now and then dine together frugally in a restaurant across the street. Silas Q. Scudamore had many little vices of the more respectable order, and was not restrained by delicacy from indulging them in many rather doubtful ways. Chief among his foibles stood curiosity. He was a born gossip, and life, and especially those parts of it in which he had no experience, interested him to the degree of passion. He was a pert, invincible questioner, pushing his inquiries with equal pertinacity and indiscretion. He had been observed, when he took a letter to the post, to weigh it in his hand, to turn it over and over, and to study the address with care, and when he found a flaw in the partition between his room and Madame Zepherin's, instead of filling it up, he enlarged and improved the opening, and made use of it as a spy-hole on his neighbor's affairs. One day, in the end of March, his curiosity growing as it was indulged, he enlarged the hole a little further, so that he might command another corner of the room. That evening, when he went as usual to inspect Madame Zepherin's movements, he was astonished to find the aperture obscured in an odd manner on the other side, and still more abashed when the obstacle was suddenly withdrawn and a titter of laughter reached his ears. Some of the plaster had evidently betrayed the secret of his spy-hole, and his neighbor had been returning the compliment in kind. Mr. Scudamore was moved to a very acute feeling of annoyance. He condemned Madame Zephyrin unmercifully, he even blamed himself, but when he found, next day, that she had taken no means to balk him of his favorite pastime, he continued to profit by her carelessness, and gratify his idle curiosity. That next day Madame Zephyrin received a long visit from a tall, loosely built man of 50 or upwards, whom Silas had not hitherto seen. His tweed suit and coloured shirt, no less than his shaggy side whiskers, identified him as a Britisher, and his dull grey eye affected Silas with a sense of cold. He kept screwing his mouth from side to side and round during the whole colloquy, which was carried on in whispers. More than once it seemed to the young New Englander as if their gestures indicated his own apartment, but the only thing definite he could gather by the most scrupulous attention was this remark made by the Englishman in a somewhat higher key, as if in answer to some reluctance or opposition. "I have studied his taste to a nicety, and I tell you again and again you are the only woman of the sort that I can lay my hands on." In answer to this, Madame Zephyrin sighed, and appeared by a gesture to resign herself, like one yielding to unqualified authority. That afternoon the observatory was finally blinded, a wardrobe having been drawn in front of it upon the other side, and while Silas was still lamenting over this misfortune, which he attributed to the Britisher's malign suggestion, the concierge brought him up a letter in a female handwriting. It was conceived in French of no very rigorous orthography, bore no signature, and in the most encouraging terms invited the young American to be present in a certain part of the Bullier Ball at 11 o'clock that night. Curiosity and timidity fought a long battle in his heart. Sometimes he was all virtue, sometimes all fire and daring, and the result of it was that, long before 10, Mr. Silas Q. Scudamore presented himself in unimpeachable attire at the door of the Bullier Ballrooms, and paid his entry money with a sense of reckless devilry that was not without its charm. It was carnival time, and the ball was very full and noisy. The lights and the crowd at first rather abashed our young adventurer, and then, mounting to his brain with a sort of intoxication, put him in possession of more than his own share of manhood. He felt ready to face the devil, and strutted in the ballroom with the swagger of a cavalier. While he was thus parading, he became aware of Madame Zephyrin and her Britisher in conference behind a pillar. The cat-like spirit of eavesdropping overcame him at once. He stole nearer and nearer on the couple from behind, until he was within earshot. "That is the man," the Britisher was saying, "there, with the long blonde hair, speaking to a girl in green." Silas identified a very handsome young fellow of small stature, who was plainly the object of this designation. "It is well," said Madame Zephyrin. "I shall do my utmost. But, remember, the best of us may fail in such a matter." "Tut!" returned her companion, "I answer for the result. Have I not chosen you from 30? Go. But be wary of the prince. I cannot think what cursed accident has brought him here tonight. As if there were not a dozen balls in Paris better worth his notice than this riot of students and counter-jumpers. See him where he sits, more like a reigning emperor at home than a prince upon his holidays." Silas was again lucky. He observed a person of rather a full build, strikingly handsome, and of a very stately and courteous demeanor, seated at table with another handsome young man, several years his junior, who addressed him with conspicuous deference. The name of Prince struck gratefully on Silas's republican hearing, and the aspect of the person to whom that name was applied exercised its usual charm upon his mind. He left Madame Zephyrin and her Englishman to take care of each other, and threading his way through the assembly, approached the table which the prince and his confidant had honoured with their choice. "I tell you, Geraldine," the former was saying, "the action is madness. Yourself, I am glad to remember it, chose your brother for this perilous service, and you are bound in duty to have a guard upon his conduct. He has consented to delay so many days in Paris. That was already an imprudence, considering the character of the man he has to deal with. But now, when he is within 48 hours of his departure, when he is within 2 or 3 days of the decisive trial, I ask you, is this a place for him to spend his time? He should be in a gallery at practice. He should be sleeping long hours and taking moderate exercise on foot. He should be on a rigorous diet, without white wines or brandy. Does the dog imagine we are all playing comedy? The thing is deadly earnest, Geraldine." "I know the lad too well to interfere," replied Colonel Geraldine, "and well enough not to be alarmed. He is more cautious than you fancy, and of an indomitable spirit. If it had been a woman I should not say so much, but I trust the President to him and the 2 valets without an instant's apprehension." "I am gratified to hear you say so," replied the Prince, "but my mind is not at rest. These servants are well-trained spies, and already has not this miscreant succeeded 3 times in eluding their observation and spending several hours on end in private, and most likely dangerous, affairs? An amateur might have lost him by accident, but if Rudolph and Jerome were thrown off the scent, it must have been done on purpose, and by a man who had a cogent reason and exceptional resources. I believe the question is now one between my brother and myself," replied Geraldine, with a shade of offence in his tone. "I permit it to be so, Colonel Geraldine," returned Prince Florizel. "Perhaps, for that very reason, you should be all the more ready to accept my counsels. But enough. That girl in yellow dances well." And the talk veered into the ordinary topics of a Paris ballroom in the carnival. Silas remembered where he was, and that the hour was already near at hand when he ought to be upon the scene of his assignation. The more he reflected the less he liked the prospect, and as at that moment an eddy in the crowd began to draw him in the direction of the door, he suffered it to carry him away without resistance. The eddy stranded him in a corner under the gallery, where his ear was immediately struck with the voice of Madame Zephyrin. She was speaking in French with the young man of the blonde locks who had been pointed out by the strange Britisher not half an hour before. "I have a character at stake," she said, "or I would put no other condition than my heart recommends. But you have only to say so much to the porter, and he will let you go by without a word." "But why this talk of debt?" objected her companion. "Heavens," said she, "do you think I do not understand my own hotel?" And she went by, clinging affectionately to her companion's arm. This put Silas in mind of his billet. 10 minutes hence, thought he, and I may be walking with as beautiful a woman as that, and even better dressed, perhaps a real lady, possibly a woman or title. And then he remembered the spelling, and was a little downcast. But it may have been written by her maid, he imagined. The clock was only a few minutes from the hour, and this immediate proximity set his heart beating at a curious and rather disagreeable speed. He reflected with relief that he was in no way bound to put in an appearance. Virtue and cowardice were together, and he made once more for the door, but this time of his own accord, and battling against the stream of people which was now moving in a contrary direction. Perhaps this prolonged resistance wearied him, Or perhaps he was in that frame of mind when merely to continue in the same determination for a certain number of minutes produces a reaction and a different purpose. Certainly, at least, he wheeled about for a third time, and did not stop until he had found a place of concealment within a few yards of the appointed place. Here he went through an agony of spirit, in which he several times prayed to God for help, for Silas had been devoutly educated. He had now not the least inclination for the meeting. Nothing kept him from flight but a silly fear lest he should be thought unmanly, but this was so powerful that it kept head against all other motives, and although it could not decide him to advance, prevented him from definitely running away. At last the clock indicated 10 minutes past the hour. Young Scudamore's spirit began to rise. He peered round the corner and saw no one at the place of meeting. Doubtless his unknown correspondent had wearied and gone away. He became as bold as he had formerly been timid. It seemed to him that if he came at all to the appointment, however late, he was clear from the charge of cowardice. Nay, now he began to suspect a hoax, and actually complimented himself on his shrewdness in having suspected and outmaneuvered his mystifiers. So very idle a thing is a boy's mind! Armed with these reflections, he advanced boldly from his corner, but he had not taken above a couple of steps before a hand was laid upon his arm. He turned and beheld a lady cast in a very large mould and with somewhat stately features, but bearing no mark of severity in her looks. "I see that you are a very self-confident lady killer," said she, "for you make yourself expected. But I was determined to meet you. When a woman has once so far forgotten herself as to make the first advance, she has long ago left behind her all considerations of petty pride." Silas was overwhelmed by the size and attractions of his correspondent and the suddenness with which she had fallen upon him. But she soon set him at his ease. She was very towardly and lenient in her behavior. She led him on to make pleasantries, and then applauded him to the echo, and in a very short time, between blandishments and a liberal exhibition of warm brandy, she had not only induced him to fancy himself in love, but to declare his passion with the greatest vehemence. "Alas," she said, "I do not know whether I ought not to deplore this moment, great as is the pleasure you give me by your words. Hitherto I was alone to suffer. Now, poor boy, there will be two. I am not my own mistress. I dare not ask you to visit me at my own house, for I am watched by jealous eyes. Let me see," she added, "I am older than you, although so much weaker, and while I trust in your courage and determination, I must employ my own knowledge of the world for our mutual benefit. Where do you live?" He told her that he lodged in a furnished hotel, and named the street and number. She seemed to reflect for some minutes, with an effort of mind. "I see," she said at last. "You will be faithful and obedient, will you not?" Silas assured her eagerly of his fidelity. "Tomorrow night, then," she continued, with an encouraging smile, "you must remain at home all the evening, and if any friends should visit you, dismiss them at once on any pretext that most readily presents itself." "Your door is probably shut by 10?" she asked. "By 11," answered Silas. "At 11:15, pursued the lady, "leave the house. Merely cry for the door to be opened, and be sure you fall into no talk with the porter, as that might ruin everything. Go straight to the corner where the Luxembourg Gardens join the boulevard. There you will find me waiting you. I trust you to follow my advice from point to point, and remember, if you fail me in only one particular, you will bring the sharpest trouble on a woman whose only fault is to have seen and loved you." "I cannot see the use of all these instructions," said Silas. "I believe you are already beginning to treat me as a master," she cried, tapping him with her fan upon the arm. "Patience, patience. That should come in time. A woman loves to be obeyed at first, although afterwards she finds her pleasure in obeying. Do as I ask you, for heaven's sake, or I will answer for nothing." Indeed, now I think of it, she added, with the manner of one who has just seen further into a difficulty, I find a better plan of keeping importunate visitors away. Tell the porter to admit no one for you, except a person who may come that night to claim a debt, and speak with some feeling, as though you feared the interview, so that he may take your words in earnest. I think you may trust me to protect myself against intruders, he said, not without a little pique. That is how I should prefer the thing arranged, she answered coldly. I know you men, you think nothing of a woman's reputation. Silas blushed and somewhat hung his head, for the scheme he had in view had involved a little vain-glorying before his acquaintances. Above all, she added, do not speak to the porter as you come out. And why? Said he. Of all your instructions, that seems to me the least important. You at first doubted the wisdom of some of the others, which you now see to be very necessary, she replied. Believe me, this also has its uses. In time you will see them. And what am I to think of your affection, if you refuse me such trifles at our first interview? Silas confounded himself in explanations and apologies. In the middle of these she looked up at the clock and clapped her hands together with a suppressed scream. Heavens, she cried, is it so late? I have not an instant to lose. Alas, we poor women, what slaves we are! What have I not risked for you already? And after repeating her directions, which she artfully combined with caresses and the most abandoned looks, she bade him farewell and disappeared among the crowd. The whole of the next day Silas was filled with a sense of great importance. He was now sure she was a countess, and when evening came he minutely obeyed her orders and was at the corner of the Luxembourg Gardens by the hour appointed. No one was there. He waited nearly half an hour, looking in the face of every one who passed or loitered near the spot. He even visited the neighboring corners of the boulevard and made a complete circuit of the garden railings. But there was no beautiful countess to throw herself into his arms. At last, and most reluctantly, he began to retrace his steps towards his hotel. On the way he remembered the words he had heard pass between Madame Zephyrin and the blonde young man, and they gave him an indefinite uneasiness. It appears, he reflected, that everyone has to tell lies to our porter. He rang the bell, the door opened before him, and the porter in his bedclothes came to offer him a light. Has he gone? Inquired the porter. He? Whom do you mean? Asked Silas, somewhat sharply, for he was irritated by his disappointment. I did not notice him go out, continued the porter, but I trust you paid him. We do not care, in this house, to have lodgers who cannot meet their liabilities. What the devil do you mean? Demanded Silas rudely. I cannot understand a word of this farrago. The short blonde young man who came for his debt, returned the other. Him it is I mean. Who else should it be, when I had your orders to admit no one else? Why, good God, of course he never came, retorted Silas. I believe what I believe, returned the porter, putting his tongue into his cheek with a most roguish air. You are an insolent scoundrel, cried Silas, and, feeling that he had made a ridiculous exhibition of asperity, and at the same time bewildered by a dozen alarms, he turned and began to run upstairs. Do you not want a light then? Cried the porter. But Silas only hurried the faster, and did not pause until he had reached the 7th landing and stood in front of his own door. There he waited a moment to recover his breath, assailed by the worst forebodings and almost dreading to enter the room. When at last he did so he was relieved to find it dark, and to all appearance, untenanted. He drew a long breath. Here he was, home again in safety, and this should be his last folly as certainly as it had been his first. The matches stood on a little table by the bed, and he began to grope his way in that direction. As he moved, his apprehensions grew upon him once more, and he was pleased, when his foot encountered an obstacle, to find it nothing more alarming than a chair. At last he touched curtains. From the position of the window, which was faintly visible, he knew he must be at the foot of the bed, and had only to feel his way along it in order to reach the table in question. He lowered his hand, but what it touched was not simply a counterpane. It was a counterpane with something underneath it like the outline of a human leg. Silas withdrew his arm and stood a moment petrified. What, he thought, can this betoken? He listened intently, but there was no sound of breathing. Once more, with a great effort, he reached out the end of his finger to the spot he had already touched. But this time he leapt back half a yard, and stood shivering and fixed with terror. There was something in his bed. What it was he knew not, but there was something there. It was some seconds before he could move. Then, guided by an instinct, he fell straight upon the matches, and keeping his back towards the bed lighted a candle. As soon as the flame had kindled, he turned slowly round and looked for what he feared to see. Sure enough, there was the worst of his imaginations realized. The coverlid was drawn carefully up over the pillow, but it molded the outline of a human body lying motionless. And when he dashed forward and flung aside the sheets, he beheld the blond young man whom he had seen in the Bullier Ball the night before, his eyes open and without speculation, his face swollen and blackened, and a thin stream of blood trickling from his nostrils. Silas uttered a long, tremulous wail, dropped the candle, and fell on his knees beside the bed. Silas was awakened from the stupor into which his terrible discovery had plunged him by a prolonged but discreet tapping at the door. It took him some seconds to remember his position, and when he hastened to prevent anyone from entering it was already too late. Dr. Noel, in a tall night-cap, carrying a lamp which lighted up his long white countenance, sidling in his gait, and peering and cocking his head like some sort of bird, pushed the door slowly open, and advanced into the middle of the room. "I thought I heard a cry," began the doctor, "and fearing you might be unwell I did not hesitate to offer this intrusion." Silas, with a flushed face and a fearful beating heart, kept between the doctor and the bed, but he found no voice to answer. "You are in the dark," pursued the doctor, "and yet you have not even begun to prepare for rest. You will not easily persuade me against my own eyesight, and your face declares most eloquently that you require either a friend or a physician. Which is it to be? Let me feel your pulse, for that is often a just reporter of the heart." He advanced to Silas, who still retreated before him backwards, and sought to take him by the wrist, but the strain on the young American's nerves had become too great for endurance. He avoided the doctor with a febrile movement, and, throwing himself upon the floor, burst into a flood of weeping. As soon as Dr. Noel perceived the dead man in the bed his face darkened, and hurrying back to the door which he had left ajar, he hastily closed and double-locked it. "Up!" he cried, addressing Silas in strident tones, "this is no time for weeping. What have you done? How came this body in your room? Speak freely to one who may be helpful. Do you imagine I would ruin you? Do you think this piece of dead flesh on your pillow can alter in any degree the sympathy with which you have inspired me? Credulous youth, the horror with which blind and unjust law regards an action never attaches to the doer in the eyes of those who love him. And if I saw the friend of my heart return to me out of seas of blood he would be in no way changed in my affection. Raise yourself," he said, "good and ill are a chimera. There is naught in life except destiny, and however you may be circumstanced there is one at your side who will help you to the last." Thus encouraged, Silas gathered himself together, and in a broken voice, and helped out by the doctor's interrogations, contrived at last to put him in possession of the facts. But the conversation between the prince and Geraldine he altogether omitted, as he had understood little of its purport, and had no idea that it was in any way related to his own misadventure. "Alas!" cried Drive. "Noel, I am much abused, or you have fallen innocently into the most dangerous hands in Europe. Poor boy, what a pit has been dug for your simplicity! Into what a deadly peril have your unwary feet been conducted? This man, he said, this Englishman, whom you twice saw, and whom I suspect to be the soul of the contrivance, can you describe him? Was he young or old? Tall or short? But Silas, who, for all his curiosity, had not a seeing eye in his head, was able to supply nothing but meagre generalities, which it was impossible to recognize. I would have it a piece of education in all schools, cried the doctor angrily. Where is the use of eyesight and articulate speech if a man cannot observe and recollect the features of his enemy? I, who know all the gangs of Europe, might have identified him, and gained new weapons for your defense. Cultivate this art in future, my poor boy. You may find it of momentous service. The future, repeated Silas. What future is there left for me except the gallows? Youth is but a cowardly season, returned the doctor, and a man's own troubles look blacker than they are. I am old, and yet I never despair. Can I tell such a story to the police? Demanded Silas. Assuredly not, replied the doctor. From what I see already of the machination in which you have been involved, your case is desperate upon that side, and for the narrow eye of the authorities you are infallibly the guilty person. And remember that we only know a portion of the plot, and the same infamous contrivers have doubtless arranged many other circumstances which would be elicited by a police inquiry, and help to fix the guilt more certainly upon your innocence. I am then lost, indeed, cried Silas. I have not said so, answered Drive. Noel, for I am a cautious man. But look at this, objected Silas, pointing to the body. Here is this object in my bed, not to be explained, not to be disposed of, not to be regarded without horror. Horror? Replied the doctor. No. When this sort of clock has run down, it is no more to me than an ingenious piece of mechanism, to be investigated with the bistoury. When blood is once cold and stagnant, it is no longer human blood. When flesh is once dead, it is no longer that flesh which we desire in our lovers and respect in our friends. The grace, the attraction, the terror, have all gone from it with the animating spirit. Accustom yourself to look upon it with composure, for if my scheme is practicable you will have to live some days in constant proximity to that which now so greatly horrifies you. Your scheme? Cried Silas. What is that? Tell me speedily, doctor, for I have scarcely courage enough to continue to exist. Without replying, Dr. Noel turned towards the bed, and proceeded to examine the corpse. Quite dead, he murmured. Yes, as I had supposed, the pockets empty. Yes, and the name cut off the shirt. Their work has been done thoroughly and well. Fortunately, he is of small stature. Silas followed these words with an extreme anxiety. At last the doctor, his autopsy completed, took a chair and addressed the young American with a smile. Since I came into your room, said he, although my ears and my tongue have been so busy, I have not suffered my eyes to remain idle. I noted a little while ago that you have there, in the corner, one of those monstrous constructions which your fellow countrymen carry with them into all quarters of the globe, in a word, a Saratoga trunk. Until this moment I have never been able to conceive the utility of these erections, but then I began to have a glimmer. Whether it was for convenience in the slave trade, or to obviate the results of too ready an employment of the Bowie knife, I cannot bring myself to decide. But one thing I see plainly, the object of such a box is to contain a human body. Surely, cried Silas, surely this is not a time for jesting. Although I may express myself with some degree of pleasantry, replied the doctor, the purport of my words is entirely serious. And the first thing we have to do, my young friend, is to empty your coffer of all that it contains. Silas, obeying the authority of Dr. Noel, put himself at his disposition. The Saratoga trunk was soon gutted of its contents, which made a considerable litter on the floor, and then, Silas taking the heels and the doctor supporting the shoulders. The body of the murdered man was carried from the bed, and, after some difficulty, doubled up and inserted whole into the empty box. With an effort on the part of both, the lid was forced down upon this unusual baggage, and the trunk was locked and corded by the doctor's own hand, while Silas disposed of what had been taken out between the closet and a chest of drawers. "Now," said the doctor, "the first step has been taken on the way to your deliverance. Tomorrow, or rather today, it must be your task to allay the suspicions of your porter, paying him all that you owe, while you may trust me to make the arrangements necessary to a safe conclusion. Meantime, follow me to my room, where I shall give you a safe and powerful opiate. For, whatever you do, you must have rest." The next day was the longest in Silas's memory. It seemed as if it would never be done. He denied himself to his friends, and sat in a corner with his eyes fixed upon the Saratoga trunk in dismal contemplation. His own former indiscretions were now returned upon him in kind. For the observatory had been once more opened, and he was conscious of an almost continual study from Madame Zepherin's apartment. So distressing did this become, that he was at last obliged to block up the spy-hole from his own side, and when he was thus secured from observation he spent a considerable portion of his time in contrite tears and prayer. Late in the evening drive, Noel entered the room carrying in his hand a pair of sealed envelopes without address, one somewhat bulky, and the other so slim as to seem without enclosure. "Silas," he said, seating himself at the table, "the time has now come for me to explain my plan for your salvation. Tomorrow morning, at an early hour, Prince Florizel of Bohemia returns to London, after having diverted himself for a few days with the Parisian Carnival. It was my fortune, a good while ago, to do Colonel Geraldine, his master of the horse, one of those services, so common in my profession, which are never forgotten upon either side. I have no need to explain to you the nature of the obligation under which he was laid. Suffice it to say that I knew him ready to serve me in any practicable manner. Now, it was necessary for you to gain London with your trunk unopened. To this the custom house seemed to oppose a fatal difficulty, but I bethought me that the baggage of so considerable a person as the prince, is, as a matter of courtesy, passed without examination by the officers of custom. I applied to Colonel Geraldine, and succeeded in obtaining a favourable answer. Tomorrow, if you go before 6 to the hotel where the prince lodges, your baggage will be passed over as a part of his, and you yourself will make the journey as a member of his suite. It seems to me, as you speak, that I have already seen both the prince and Colonel Geraldine. I even overheard some of their conversation the other evening at the Bullier Ball. It is probable enough, for the prince loves to mix with all societies," replied the doctor. Once arrived in London, he pursued, "your task is nearly ended. In this more bulky envelope I have given you a letter which I dare not address, but in the other you will find the designation of the house to which you must carry it along with your box, which will there be taken from you and not trouble you any more." "Alas," said Silas, "I have every wish to believe you, but how is it possible? You open up to me a bright prospect, but, I ask you, is my mind capable of receiving so unlikely a solution? Be more generous, and let me further understand your meaning." The doctor seemed painfully impressed. "Boy," he answered, "you do not know how hard a thing you ask of me. But be it so. I am now inured to humiliation, and it would be strange if I refused you this, after having granted you so much. Know, then, that although I now make so quiet an appearance, frugal, solitary, addicted to study, when I was younger, my name was once a rallying cry among the most astute and dangerous spirits of London, and while I was outwardly an object for respect and consideration, my true power resided in the most secret, terrible, and criminal relations. It is to one of the persons who then obeyed me that I now address myself to deliver you from your burden. They were men of many different nations and dexterities, all bound together by a formidable oath, and working to the same purposes. The trade of the association was in murder, and I who speak to you, innocent as I appear, was the chieftain of this redoubtable crew. What? Cried Silas. A murderer? And one with whom murder was a trade? Can I take your hand? Ought I so much as to accept your services? Dark and criminal old man, would you make an accomplice of my youth and my distress? The doctor bitterly laughed. You are difficult to please, Mr. Scudamore, said he, but I now offer you your choice of company between the murdered man and the murderer. If your conscience is too nice to accept my aid, say so, and I will immediately leave you. Thenceforward you can deal with your trunk and its belongings as best suits your upright conscience. I own myself wrong, replied Silas. I should have remembered how generously you offered to shield me, even before I had convinced you of my innocence, and I continue to listen to your counsels with gratitude. That is well, returned the doctor, and I perceive you are beginning to learn some of the lessons of experience. At the same time, resumed the New Englander, as you confess yourself accustomed to this tragical business, and the people to whom you recommend me are your own former associates and friends, could you not yourself undertake the transport of the box, and rid me at once of its detested presence? Upon my word, replied the doctor, I admire you cordially. If you do not think I have already meddled sufficiently in your concerns, believe me, from my heart I think the contrary. Take or leave my services as I offer them, and trouble me with no more words of gratitude, for I value your consideration even more lightly than I do your intellect. A time will come, if you should be spared to see a number of years in health of mind, when you will think differently of all this, and blush for your tonight's behavior. So saying, the doctor arose from his chair, repeated his directions briefly and clearly, and departed from the room without permitting Silas any time to answer. The next morning Silas presented himself at the hotel, where he was politely received by Colonel Geraldine, and relieved, from that moment, of all immediate alarm about his trunk and its grisly contents. The journey passed over without much incident, although the young man was horrified to overhear the sailors and railway porters complaining among themselves about the unusual weight of the prince's baggage. Silas travelled in a carriage with the valets, for Prince Florizel chose to be alone with his master of the horse. On board the steamer, however, Silas attracted His Highness's attention by the melancholy of his air and attitude as he stood gazing at the pile of baggage, for he was still full of disquietude about the future. There is a young man, observed the prince, who must have some cause for sorrow. That, replied Geraldine, is the American for whom I obtained permission to travel with your suite. You remind me that I have been remiss in courtesy, said Prince Florizel, and advancing to Silas, he addressed him with the most exquisite condescension in these words. I was charmed, young sir, to be able to gratify the desire you made known to me through Colonel Geraldine. Remember, if you please, that I shall be glad at any future time to lay you under a more serious obligation. And he then put some questions as to the political condition of America, which Silas answered with sense and propriety. You are still a young man, said the prince, but I observe you to be very serious for your years. Perhaps you allow your attention to be too much occupied with grave studies. But, perhaps, on the other hand, I am myself indiscreet and touch upon a painful subject. I have certainly cause to be the most miserable of men, said Silas. Never has a more innocent person been more dismally abused. I will not ask you for your confidence, returned Prince Florizel. But do not forget that Colonel Geraldine's recommendation is an unfailing passport, and that I am not only willing, but possibly more able than many others, to do you a service. Silas was delighted with the amiability of this great personage, but his mind soon returned upon its gloomy preoccupations, for not even the favor of a prince to a republican can discharge a brooding spirit of its cares. The train arrived at Charing Cross, where the officers of the revenue respected the baggage of Prince Florizel in the usual manner. The most elegant equipages were in waiting, and Silas was driven, along with the rest, to the prince's residence. There Colonel Geraldine sought him out, and expressed himself pleased to have been of any service to a friend of the physician's, for whom he professed a great consideration. "I hope," he added, "that you will find none of your porcelain injured." Special orders were given along the line to deal tenderly with the prince's effects. And then, directing the servants to place one of the carriages at the young gentleman's disposal, and at once to charge the Saratoga trunk upon the dickey, the colonel shook hands and excused himself on account of his occupations in the princely household. Silas now broke the seal of the envelope containing the address, and directed the stately footman to drive him to Box Court, opening off the Strand. It seemed as if the place were not at all unknown to the man, for he looked startled and begged a repetition of the order. It was with a heart full of alarms, that Silas mounted into the luxurious vehicle, and was driven to his destination. The entrance to Box Court was too narrow for the passage of a coach. It was a mere footway between railings, with a post at either end. On one of these posts was seated a man, who at once jumped down and exchanged a friendly sign with the driver, while the footman opened the door and inquired of Silas whether he should take down the Saratoga trunk, and to what number it should be carried. "If you please," said Silas. "To number 3. The footman and the man who had been sitting on the post, even with the aid of Silas himself, had hard work to carry in the trunk, and before it was deposited at the door of the house in question, the young American was horrified to find a score of loiterers looking on. But he knocked with as good a countenance as he could muster up, and presented the other envelope to him who opened. "He is not at home," said he, "but if you will leave your letter and return tomorrow early, I shall be able to inform you whether and when he can receive your visit. Would you like to leave your box?" he added. "Dearly," cried Silas, and the next moment he repented his precipitation, and declared, with equal emphasis, that he would rather carry the box along with him to the hotel. The crowd jeered at his indecision and followed him to the carriage with insulting remarks, and Silas, covered with shame and terror, implored the servants to conduct him to some quiet and comfortable house of entertainment in the immediate neighborhood. The prince's equipage deposited Silas at the Craven Hotel in Craven Street, and immediately drove away, leaving him alone with the servants of the inn. The only vacant room, it appeared, was a little den up 4 pairs of stairs, and looking towards the back. To this hermitage, with infinite trouble and complaint, a pair of stout porters carried the Saratoga trunk. It is needless to mention that Silas kept closely at their heels throughout the ascent, and had his heart in his mouth at every corner. A single false step, he reflected, and the box might go over the banisters and land its fatal contents, plainly discovered, on the pavement of the hall. Arrived in the room, he sat down on the edge of his bed to recover from the agony that he had just endured, but he had hardly taken his position when he was recalled to a sense of his peril by the action of the boots, who had knelt beside the trunk, and was proceeding officiously to undo its elaborate fastenings. "Let it be," cried Silas. "I shall want nothing from it while I stay here." "You might have let it lie in the hall, then," growled the man. "A thing as big and heavy as a church. What you have inside I cannot fancy. If it is all money, you are a richer man than me." "Money?" repeated Silas, in a sudden perturbation. "What do you mean by money? I have no money, and you are speaking like a fool." "All right, Captain," retorted the boots with a wink. "There's nobody will touch your lordship's money. I'm as safe as the bank," he added, "but as the box is heavy, I shouldn't mind drinking something to your lordship's health." Silas pressed 2 Napoleons upon his acceptance, apologizing, at the same time, for being obliged to trouble him with foreign money, and pleading his recent arrival for excuse. And the man, grumbling with even greater fervor, and looking contemptuously from the money in his hand to the Saratoga trunk and back again from the one to the other, at last consented to withdraw. For nearly 2 days the dead body had been packed into Silas's box, and as soon as he was alone the unfortunate New Englander nosed all the cracks and openings with the most passionate attention. But the weather was cool, and the trunk still managed to contain his shocking secret. He took a chair beside it, and buried his face in his hands, and his mind in the most profound reflection. If he were not speedily relieved, no question but he must be speedily discovered. Alone in a strange city, without friends or accomplices, if the doctor's introduction failed him, he was indubitably a lost New Englander. He reflected pathetically over his ambitious designs for the future. He should not now become the hero and spokesman of his native place of Bangor, Maine. He should not, as he had fondly anticipated, move on from office to office, from honor to honor. He might as well divest himself at once of all hope of being acclaimed President of the United States, and leaving behind him a statue, in the worst possible style of art, to adorn the Capitol at Washington. Here he was, chained to a dead Englishman doubled up inside a Saratoga trunk, whom he must get rid of, or perish from the rolls of national glory. I should be afraid to chronicle the language employed by this young man to the doctor, to the murdered man, to Madame Zephyrin, to the boots of the hotel, to the prince's servants, and, in a word, to all who had been ever so remotely connected with his horrible misfortune. He slunk down to dinner about 7 at night, but the yellow coffee room appalled him, the eyes of the other diners seemed to rest on his with suspicion, and his mind remained upstairs with the Saratoga trunk. When the waiter came to offer him cheese, his nerves were already so much on edge that he leapt halfway out of his chair and upset the remainder of a pint of ale upon the tablecloth. The fellow offered to show him to the smoking room when he had done, and although he would have much preferred to return at once to his perilous treasure, he had not the courage to refuse, and was shown downstairs to the black, gas-lit cellar, which formed, and possibly still forms, the divan of the Craven Hotel. 2 very sad betting men were playing billiards, attended by a moist, consumptive marker, and for the moment Silas imagined that these were the only occupants of the apartment. But at the next glance his eye fell upon a person smoking in the farthest corner, with lowered eyes and a most respectable and modest aspect. He knew at once that he had seen the face before, and, in spite of the entire change of clothes, recognized the man whom he had found seated on a post at the entrance to Box Court, and who had helped him to carry the trunk to and from the carriage. The New Englander simply turned and ran, nor did he pause until he had locked and bolted himself into his bedroom. There, all night long, a prey to the most terrible imaginations, he watched beside the fatal boxful of dead flesh. The suggestion of the boots that his trunk was full of gold inspired him with all manner of new terrors, if he so much as dared to close an eye, and the presence in the smoking room, and under an obvious disguise, of the loiterer from Box Court convinced him that he was once more the center of obscure machinations. Midnight had sounded some time, when, impelled by uneasy suspicions, Silas opened his bedroom door and peered into the passage. It was dimly illuminated by a single jet of gas, and some distance off he perceived a man sleeping on the floor in the costume of an hotel under-servant. Silas drew near the man on tiptoe. He lay partly on his back, partly on his side, and his right forearm concealed his face from recognition. Suddenly, while the American was still bending over him, the sleeper removed his arm and opened his eyes, and Silas found himself once more face to face with the loiterer of Box Court. "Good night, sir," said the man, pleasantly. But Silas was too profoundly moved to find an answer, and regained his room in silence. Towards morning, worn out by apprehension, he fell asleep on his chair, with his head forward on the trunk. In spite of so constrained an attitude and such a grisly pillow, his slumber was sound and prolonged, and he was only awakened at a late hour and by a sharp tapping at the door. He hurried to open, and found the Boots without. "You are the gentleman who called yesterday at Box Court?" he asked. Silas, with a quaver, admitted that he had done so. "Then this note is for you," added the servant, proffering a sealed envelope. Silas tore it open, and found inside the words, 12 o'clock. He was punctual to the hour. The trunk was carried before him by several stout servants, and he was himself ushered into a room, where a man sat warming himself before the fire with his back towards the door. The sound of so many persons entering and leaving, and the scraping of the trunk as it was deposited upon the bare boards, were alike unable to attract the notice of the occupant, and Silas stood waiting, in an agony of fear, until he should deign to recognize his presence. Perhaps 5 minutes had elapsed before the man turned leisurely about, and disclosed the features of Prince Florizel of Bohemia. "So, sir," he said, with great severity, "this is the manner in which you abuse my politeness. You join yourselves to persons of condition, I perceive, for no other purpose than to escape the consequences of your crimes, and I can readily understand your embarrassment when I addressed myself to you yesterday." "Indeed," cried Silas, "I am innocent of everything except misfortune." And in a hurried voice, and with the greatest ingenuousness, he recounted to the prince the whole history of his calamity. "I see I have been mistaken," said his highness, when he had heard him to an end. "You are no other than a victim, and since I am not to punish you may be sure I shall do my utmost to help. And now," he continued, "to business. Open your box at once, and let me see what it contains." Silas changed color. "I almost fear to look upon it," he exclaimed. "Nay," replied the prince, "have you not looked at it already? This is a form of sentimentality to be resisted. The sight of a sick man, whom we can still help, should appeal more directly to the feelings than that of a dead man who is equally beyond help or harm, love or hatred. Nerve yourself, Mr. Scudamore," and then, seeing that Silas still hesitated, "I do not desire to give another name to my request," he added. The young American awoke as if out of a dream, and with a shiver of repugnance addressed himself to loose the straps and open the lock of the Saratoga trunk. The prince stood by, watching with a composed countenance and his hands behind his back. The body was quite stiff, and it cost Silas a great effort, both moral and physical, to dislodge it from its position, and discover the face. Prince Florizel started back with an exclamation of painful surprise. "Alas!" he cried, "you little know, Mr. Scudamore, what a cruel gift you have brought me. This is a young man of my own suite, the brother of my trusted friend, and it was upon matters of my own service that he has thus perished at the hands of violent and treacherous men. Poor Geraldine," he went on, as if to himself, "in what words am I to tell you of your brother's fate? How can I excuse myself in your eyes, or in the eyes of God, for the presumptuous schemes that led him to this bloody and unnatural death? Ah, Florizel! Florizel! When will you learn the discretion that suits mortal life, and be no longer dazzled with the image of power at your disposal?" "Power!" he cried. "Who is more powerless? I look upon this young man whom I have sacrificed, Mr. Scudamore, and feel how small a thing it is to be a prince." Silas was moved at the sight of his emotion. He tried to murmur some consolatory words, and burst into tears. The prince, touched by his obvious intention, came up to him and took him by the hand. "Command yourself," said he. "We have both much to learn, and we shall both be better men for today's meeting." Silas thanked him in silence with an affectionate look. "Write me the address of Dr. Noel on this piece of paper," continued the prince, leading him towards the table, "and let me recommend you, when you are again in Paris, to avoid the society of that dangerous man. He has acted in this matter on a generous inspiration, that I must believe. had he been privy to young Geraldine's death, he would never have dispatched the body to the care of the actual criminal. The actual criminal, repeated Silas in astonishment. Even so, returned the prince. This letter, which the disposition of Almighty Providence has so strangely delivered into my hands, was addressed to no less a person than the criminal himself, the infamous president of the Suicide Club. Seek to pry no further in these perilous affairs, but content yourself with your own miraculous escape, and leave this house at once. I have pressing affairs, and must arrange at once about this poor Clay, which was so lately a gallant and handsome youth. Silas took a grateful and submissive leave of Prince Florizel, but he lingered in Box Court until he saw him depart in a splendid carriage on a visit to Colonel Henderson of the police. Republican as he was, the young American took off his hat with almost a sentiment of devotion to the retreating carriage. And the same night he started by rail on his return to Paris. Here, observes my Arabian author, is the end of the history of the physician and the Saratoga trunk. Omitting some reflections on the power of Providence, highly pertinent in the original, but little suited to our Occidental taste, I shall only add that Mr. Scudamore has already begun to mount the ladder of political fame, and by last advices was the sheriff of his native town.
KaraokeBooks.
The Adventure of the Hansom Cabs. Lieutenant Brackenbury Rich had greatly distinguished himself in one of the lesser Indian Hill Wars. He it was who took the chieftain prisoner with his own hand. His gallantry was universally applauded, and when he came home, prostrated by an ugly saber cut and a protracted jungle fever, society was prepared to welcome the lieutenant as a celebrity of minor luster. But his was a character remarkable for unaffected modesty. Adventure was dear to his heart, but he cared little for adulation, and he waited at foreign watering places and in Algiers until the fame of his exploits had run through its 9 days' vitality and begun to be forgotten. He arrived in London at last, in the early season, with as little observation as he could desire, and as he was an orphan and had none but distant relatives who lived in the provinces, it was almost as a foreigner that he installed himself in the capital of the country for which he had shed his blood. On the day following his arrival, he dined alone at a military club. He shook hands with a few old comrades, and received their warm congratulations, but as one and all had some engagement for the evening, he found himself left entirely to his own resources. He was in dress, for he had entertained the notion of visiting a theatre. But the great city was new to him. He had gone from a provincial school to a military college, and thence direct to the Eastern Empire, and he promised himself a variety of delights in this world for exploration. Swinging his cane, he took his way westward. It was a mild evening, already dark, and now and then threatening rain. The succession of faces in the lamplight stirred the lieutenant's imagination, and it seemed to him as if he could walk forever in that stimulating city atmosphere and surrounded by the mystery of 4 million private lives. He glanced at the houses, and marveled what was passing behind those warmly lighted windows. He looked into face after face, and saw them each intent upon some unknown interest, criminal or kindly. They talk of war, he thought, but this is the great battlefield of mankind. And then he began to wonder that he should walk so long in this complicated scene, and not chance upon so much as the shadow of an adventure for himself. All in good time, he reflected. I am still a stranger, and perhaps wear a strange air. But I must be drawn into the eddy before long. The night was already well advanced when a plump of cold rain fell suddenly out of the darkness. Brackenbury paused under some trees, and as he did so he caught sight of a handsome cabman making him a sign that he was disengaged. The circumstance fell in so happily to the occasion that he at once raised his cane in answer, and had soon ensconced himself in the London gondola. "Where to, sir?" asked the driver. "Where you please," said Brackenbury. And immediately, at a pace of surprising swiftness, the hansom drove off through the rain into a maze of villas. One villa was so like another, each with its front garden, and there was so little to distinguish the deserted lamp-lit streets and crescents through which the flying hansom took its way, that Brackenbury soon lost all idea of direction. He would have been tempted to believe that the cabman was amusing himself by driving him round and in and out about a small quarter, but there was something businesslike in the speed which convinced him of the contrary. The man had an object in view, he was hastening towards a definite end, and Brackenbury was at once astonished at the fellow's skill in picking a way through such a labyrinth, and a little concerned to imagine what was the occasion of his hurry. He had heard tales of strangers falling ill in London. Did the driver belong to some bloody and treacherous association? And was he himself being whirled to a murderous death? The thought had scarcely presented itself, when the cab swung sharply round a corner and pulled up before the garden gate of a villa in a long and wide road. The house was brilliantly lighted up. Another hansom had just driven away, and Brackenbury could see a gentleman being admitted at the front door and received by several liveried servants. He was surprised that the cabman should have stopped so immediately in front of a house where a reception was being held, but he did not doubt it was the result of accident, and sat placidly smoking where he was, until he heard the trap thrown open over his head. "Here we are, sir," said the driver. "Here," repeated Brackenbury. "Where?" "You told me to take you where I pleased, sir," returned the man with a chuckle, "and here we are." It struck Brackenbury that the voice was wonderfully smooth and courteous for a man in so inferior a position. He remembered the speed at which he had been driven, and now it occurred to him that the hansom was more luxuriously appointed than the common run of public conveyances. "I must ask you to explain," said he. "Do you mean to turn me out into the rain?" "My good man, I suspect the choice is mine." "The choice is certainly yours," replied the driver. "But when I tell you all, I believe I know how a gentleman of your figure will decide. There is a gentleman's party in this house. I do not know whether the master be a stranger to London and without acquaintances of his own, or whether he is a man of odd notions. But certainly I was hired to kidnap single gentlemen in evening dress, as many as I pleased, but military officers by preference. You have simply to go in and say that Mr. Morris invited you." "Are you Mr. Morris?" inquired the lieutenant. "Oh, no," replied the cabman. "Mr. Morris is the person of the house." "It is not a common way of collecting guests," said Brackenbury, "but an eccentric man might very well indulge the whim without any intention to offend. And suppose that I refuse Mr. Morris's invitation," he went on, "what then?" "My orders are to drive you back where I took you from," replied the man, "and set out to look for others up to midnight." "Those who have no fancy for such an adventure," Mr. Morris said, "were not the guests for him." These words decided the lieutenant on the spot. "After all," he reflected, as he descended from the hansom, "I have not had long to wait for my adventure." He had hardly found footing on the sidewalk, and was still feeling in his pocket for the fare, when the cab swung about and drove off by the way it came at the former break-neck velocity. Brackenbury shouted after the man, who paid no heed, and continued to drive away. But the sound of his voice was overheard in the house. The door was again thrown open, emitting a flood of light upon the garden, and a servant ran down to meet him holding an umbrella. "The cabman has been paid," observed the servant in a very civil tone, and he proceeded to escort Brackenbury along the path and up the steps. In the hall several other attendants relieved him of his hat, cane, and paletot, gave him a ticket with a number in return, and politely hurried him up a stair adorned with tropical flowers, to the door of an apartment on the first story. Here a grave butler inquired his name, and announcing, "Lieutenant Brackenbury Rich," ushered him into the drawing-room of the house. A young man, slender and singularly handsome, came forward and greeted him with an air at once courtly and affectionate. Hundreds of candles, of the finest wax, lit up a room that was perfumed, like the staircase, with a profusion of rare and beautiful flowering shrubs. A side table was loaded with tempting viands. Several servants went to and fro with fruits and goblets of champagne. The company was perhaps 16 in number, all men, few beyond the prime of life, and with hardly an exception, of a dashing and capable exterior. They were divided into two groups, one about a roulette board, and the other surrounding a table at which one of their number held a bank of baccarat. "I see," thought Brackenbury, "I am in a private gambling saloon," and the cabman was a tout. His eye had embraced the details, and his mind formed the conclusion, while his host was still holding him by the hand, and to him his looks returned from this rapid survey. At a second view Mr. Morris surprised him still more than on the first. The easy elegance of his manners, the distinction, amiability, and courage that appeared upon his features, fitted very ill with the lieutenant's preconceptions on the subject of the proprietor of a hell, and the tone of his conversation seemed to mark him out for a man of position and merit. Brackenbury found he had an instinctive liking for his entertainer, and though he chid himself for the weakness, he was unable to resist a sort of friendly attraction for Mr. Morris's person and character. "I have heard of you, Lieutenant Rich," said Mr. Morris, lowering his tone, "and believe me, I am gratified to make your acquaintance. Your looks accord with the reputation that has preceded you from India. And if you will forget for a while the irregularity of your presentation in my house, I shall feel it not only an honor, but a genuine pleasure besides. A man who makes a mouthful of barbarian cavaliers," he added with a laugh, "should not be appalled by a breach of etiquette, however serious." And he led him towards the sideboard and pressed him to partake of some refreshment. Upon my word, the lieutenant reflected, this is one of the pleasantest fellows and, I do not doubt, one of the most agreeable societies in London. He partook of some champagne, which he found excellent, and observing that many of the company were already smoking, he lit one of his own manillas, and strolled up to the roulette board, where he sometimes made a stake and sometimes looked on smilingly on the fortune of others. It was while he was thus idling that he became aware of a sharp scrutiny to which the whole of the guests were subjected. Mr. Morris went here and there, ostensibly busied on hospitable concerns, but he had ever a shrewd glance at disposal. Not a man of the party escaped his sudden, searching looks. He took stock of the bearing of heavy losers, he valued the amount of the stakes, he paused behind couples who were deep in conversation. And, in a word, there was hardly a characteristic of anyone present but he seemed to catch and make a note of it. Brackenbury began to wonder if this were indeed a gambling hell. It had so much the air of a private inquisition. He followed Mr. Morris in all his movements, and although the man had a ready smile, he seemed to perceive, as it were under a mask, a haggard, careworn, and preoccupied spirit. The fellows around him laughed and made their game, but Brackenbury had lost interest in the guests. "This Morris," thought he, "is no idler in the room. Some deep purpose inspires him. Let it be mine to fathom it." Now and then Mr. Morris would call one of his visitors aside, and after a brief colloquy in an anteroom, he would return alone, and the visitors in question reappeared no more. After a certain number of repetitions, this performance excited Brackenbury's curiosity to a high degree. He determined to be at the bottom of this minor mystery at once, and strolling into the anteroom, found a deep window recess concealed by curtains of the fashionable green. Here he hurriedly ensconced himself, nor had he to wait long before the sound of steps and voices drew near him from the principal apartment. Peering through the division, he saw Mr. Morris escorting a fat and ruddy personage, with somewhat the look of a commercial traveller, whom Brackenbury had already remarked for his coarse laugh and underbred behaviour at the table. The pair halted immediately before the window, so that Brackenbury lost not a word of the following discourse. "I beg you 1,000 pardons. began Mr. Morris, with the most conciliatory manner. "And, if I appear rude, I am sure you will readily forgive me. In a place so great as London accidents must continually happen, and the best that we can hope is to remedy them with as small delay as possible. I will not deny that I fear you have made a mistake and honored my poor house by inadvertence. For, to speak openly, I cannot at all remember your appearance. Let me put the question without unnecessary circumlocution. Between gentlemen of honor a word will suffice. Under whose roof do you suppose yourself to be?" "That of Mr. Morris," replied the other, with a prodigious display of confusion, which had been visibly growing upon him throughout the last few words. "Mr. John or Mr. James Morris?" inquired the host. "I really cannot tell you," returned the unfortunate guest. "I am not personally acquainted with the gentleman, any more than I am with yourself." "I see," said Mr. Morris. "There is another person of the same name farther down the street, and I have no doubt the policeman will be able to supply you with his number. Believe me, I felicitate myself on the misunderstanding which has procured me the pleasure of your company for so long, and let me express a hope that we may meet again upon a more regular footing. Meantime, I would not for the world detain you longer from your friends. John," he added, raising his voice, "will you see that this gentleman finds his great coat?" And with the most agreeable air Mr. Morris escorted his visitor as far as the ante-room door, where he left him under conduct of the butler. As he passed the window, on his return to the drawing-room, Brackenbury could hear him utter a profound sigh, as though his mind was loaded with a great anxiety, and his nerves already fatigued with the task on which he was engaged. For perhaps an hour the hansoms kept arriving with such frequency, that Mr. Morris had to receive a new guest for every old one that he sent away, and the company preserved its number undiminished. But towards the end of that time the arrivals grew few and far between, and at length ceased entirely, while the process of elimination was continued with unimpaired activity. The drawing-room began to look empty. The baccarat was discontinued for lack of a banker. More than one person said good night of his own accord, and was suffered to depart without expostulation. And in the meanwhile Mr. Morris redoubled in agreeable attentions to those who stayed behind. He went from group to group and from person to person with looks of the readiest sympathy and the most pertinent and pleasing talk. He was not so much like a host as like a hostess, and there was a feminine coquetry and condescension in his manner which charmed the hearts of all. As the guests grew thinner, Lieutenant Rich strolled for a moment out of the drawing-room into the hall in quest of fresher air. But he had no sooner passed the threshold of the ante-chamber than he was brought to a dead halt by a discovery of the most surprising nature. The flowering shrubs had disappeared from the staircase. 3 large furniture wagons stood before the garden gate. The servants were busy dismantling the house upon all sides, and some of them had already donned their great coats and were preparing to depart. It was like the end of a country ball, where everything has been supplied by contract. Brackenbury had indeed some matter for reflection. First, the guests, who were no real guests after all, had been dismissed, and now the servants, who could hardly be genuine servants, were actively dispersing. Was the whole establishment a sham? He asked himself. The mushroom of a single night which should disappear before morning. Watching a favorable opportunity, Brackenbury dashed upstairs to the highest regions of the house. It was as he had expected. He ran from room to room, and saw not a stick of furniture nor so much as a picture on the walls. Although the house had been painted and papered, it was not only uninhabited at present, but plainly had never been inhabited at all. The young officer remembered with astonishment its specious, settled, and hospitable air on his arrival. It was only at a prodigious cost that the imposture could have been carried out upon so great a scale. Who, then, was Mr. Morris? What was his intention in thus playing the householder for a single night in the remote west of London? And why did he collect his visitors at hazard from the streets? Brackenbury remembered that he had already delayed too long, and hastened to join the company. Many had left during his absence, and counting the lieutenant and his host, there were not more than 5 persons in the drawing-room, recently so thronged. Mr. Morris greeted him, as he re-entered the apartment, with a smile, and immediately rose to his feet. "It is now time, gentlemen," said he, "to explain my purpose in decoying you from your amusements. I trust you did not find the evening hang very dully on your hands, but my object, I will confess it, was not to entertain your leisure, but to help myself in an unfortunate necessity. You are all gentlemen," he continued, "your appearance does you that much justice, and I ask for no better security. Hence, I speak it without concealment, I ask you to render me a dangerous and delicate service. Dangerous because you may run the hazard of your lives, and delicate because I must ask an absolute discretion upon all that you shall see or hear. From an utter stranger the request is almost comically extravagant. I am well aware of this, and I would add at once, if there be any one present who has heard enough, if there be one among the party who recoils from a dangerous confidence and a piece of quixotic devotion to he knows not whom, here is my hand ready, and I shall wish him good night and Godspeed with all the sincerity in the world." A very tall, black man, with a heavy stoop, immediately responded to this appeal. "I commend your frankness, sir," said he, "and, for my part, I go. I make no reflections, but I cannot deny that you fill me with suspicious thoughts. I go myself, as I say, and perhaps you will think I have no right to add words to my example." "On the contrary," replied Mr. Morris, "I am obliged to you for all you say. It would be impossible to exaggerate the gravity of my proposal." "Well, gentlemen, what do you say?" said the tall man, addressing the others. "We have had our evening's frolic. Shall we all go homeward peaceably in a body? You will think well of my suggestion in the morning, when you see the sun again in innocence and safety." The speaker pronounced the last words with an intonation which added to their force, and his face wore a singular expression, full of gravity and significance. Another of the company rose hastily, and, with some appearance of alarm, prepared to take his leave. There were only 2 who held their ground, Brackenbury and an old red-nosed cavalry major, but these 2 preserved a nonchalant demeanor, and, beyond a look of intelligence which they rapidly exchanged, appeared entirely foreign to the discussion that had just been terminated. Mr. Morris conducted the deserters as far as the door, which he closed upon their heels, then he turned round, disclosing a countenance of mingled relief and animation, and addressed the 2 officers as follows. "I have chosen my men like Joshua in the Bible," said Mr. Morris, "and I now believe I have the pick of London. Your appearance pleased my handsome cabman. Then it delighted me. I have watched your behavior in a strange company, and under the most unusual circumstances. I have studied how you played and how you bore your losses. Lastly, I have put you to the test of a staggering announcement, and you received it like an invitation to dinner. It is not for nothing," he cried, "that I have been for years the companion and the pupil of the bravest and wisest potentate in Europe." "At the affair of Bunderchang," observed the major, "I asked for 12 volunteers, and every trooper in the ranks replied to my appeal. But a gaming party is not the same thing as a regiment under fire. You may be pleased, I suppose, to have found 2, and 2 who will not fail you at a push. As for the pair who ran away, I count them among the most pitiful hounds I ever met with. Lieutenant Rich," he added, addressing Brackenbury, "I have heard much of you of late, and I cannot doubt but you have also heard of me. I am Major O'Rourke." And the veteran tendered his hand, which was red and tremulous, to the young lieutenant. "Who has not?" answered Brackenbury. "When this little matter is settled," said Mr. Morris, "you will think I have sufficiently rewarded you. For I could offer neither a more valuable service than to make him acquainted with the other." "And now," said Major O'Rourke, "is it a duel?" "A duel after a fashion, replied Mr. Morris, "a duel with unknown and dangerous enemies, and, as I gravely fear, a duel to the death. I must ask you," he continued, "to call me Morris no longer. Call me, if you please, Hammersmith, my real name, as well as that of another person to whom I hope to present you before long. You will gratify me by not asking and not seeking to discover for yourselves. 3 days ago the person of whom I speak disappeared suddenly from home. And, until this morning, I received no hint of his situation. You will fancy my alarm when I tell you that he is engaged upon a work of private justice. Bound by an unhappy oath, too lightly sworn, he finds it necessary, without the help of law, to rid the earth of an insidious and bloody villain. Already 2 of our friends, and one of them my own born brother, have perished in the enterprise. He himself, or I am much deceived, is taken in the same fatal toils. But at least he still lives and still hopes, as this billet sufficiently proves." And the speaker, no other than Colonel Geraldine, proffered a letter, thus conceived. "Major Hammersmith, on Wednesday, at 3 a.m., you will be admitted by the small door to the gardens of Rochester House, Regent's Park, by a man who is entirely in my interest. I must request you not to fail me by a second. Pray bring my case of swords, and, if you can find them, 1 or 2 gentlemen of conduct and discretion to whom my person is unknown. My name must not be used in this affair. T. Godall." From his wisdom alone, if he had no other title, pursued Colonel Geraldine, when the others had each satisfied his curiosity, my friend is a man whose directions should implicitly be followed. I need not tell you, therefore, that I have not so much as visited the neighborhood of Rochester House, and that I am still as wholly in the dark as either of yourselves as to the nature of my friend's dilemma. I betook myself, as soon as I had received this order, to a furnishing contractor, and, in a few hours, the house in which we now are had assumed its late air of festival. My scheme was at least original, and I am far from regretting an action which has procured me the services of Major O'Rourke and Lieutenant Brackenbury Rich. But the servants in the street will have a strange awakening. The house which this evening was full of lights and visitors they will find uninhabited and for sale tomorrow morning. Thus even the most serious concerns, added the Colonel, have a merry side. And let us add a merry ending, said Brackenbury. The Colonel consulted his watch. It is now hard on 2, he said. We have an hour before us, and a swift cab is at the door. Tell me if I may count upon your help. During a long life, replied Major O'Rourke, I never took back my hand from anything, nor so much as hedged a bet. Brackenbury signified his readiness in the most becoming terms, and after they had drunk a glass or 2 of wine, the Colonel gave each of them a loaded revolver, and the 3 mounted into the cab and drove off for the address in question. Rochester House was a magnificent residence on the banks of the canal. The large extent of the garden isolated it in an unusual degree from the annoyances of neighborhood. It seemed the park aux cerfs of some great nobleman or millionaire. As far as could be seen from the street, there was not a glimmer of light in any of the numerous windows of the mansion, and the place had a look of neglect, as though the master had been long from home. The cab was discharged, and the 3 gentlemen were not long in discovering the small door, which was a sort of postern in a lane between 2 garden walls. It still wanted 10 or 15 minutes of the appointed time. The rain fell heavily, and the adventurers sheltered themselves below some pendant ivy, and spoke in low tones of the approaching trial. Suddenly Geraldine raised his finger to command silence, and all 3 bent their hearing to the utmost. Through the continuous noise of the rain, the steps and voices of 2 men became audible from the other side of the wall, and, as they drew nearer, Brackenbury, whose sense of hearing was remarkably acute, could even distinguish some fragments of their talk. Is the grave dug? Asked one. It is, replied the other, behind the laurel hedge. When the job is done, we can cover it with a pile of steaks." The first speaker laughed, and the sound of his merriment was shocking to the listeners on the other side. "In an hour from now," he said. And by the sound of the steps it was obvious that the pair had separated, and were proceeding in contrary directions. Almost immediately after the postern door was cautiously open, a white face was protruded into the lane, and a hand was seen beckoning to the watchers. In dead silence the three passed the door, which was immediately locked behind them, and followed their guide through several garden alleys to the kitchen entrance of the house. A single candle burned in the great paved kitchen, which was destitute of the customary furniture, and as the party proceeded to ascend from thence by a flight of winding stairs, a prodigious noise of rats testified still more plainly to the dilapidation of the house. Their conductor preceded them, carrying the candle. He was a lean man, much bent, but still agile, and he turned from time to time and admonished silence and caution by his gestures. Colonel Geraldine followed on his heels, the case of swords under one arm, and a pistol ready in the other. Brackenbury's heart beat thickly. He perceived that they were still in time, but he judged from the alacrity of the old man that the hour of action must be near at hand, and the circumstances of this adventure were so obscure and menacing, the place seemed so well chosen for the darkest acts, that an older man than Brackenbury might have been pardoned a measure of emotion as he closed the procession up the winding stair. At the top the guide threw open a door and ushered the three officers before him into a small apartment, lighted by a smoky lamp and the glow of a modest fire. At the chimney corner sat a man in the early prime of life, and of a stout but courtly and commanding appearance. His attitude and expression were those of the most unmoved composure. He was smoking a cheroot with much enjoyment and deliberation, and on a table by his elbow stood a long glass of some effervescing beverage which diffused an agreeable odor through the room. "Welcome," said he, extending his hand to Colonel Geraldine. "I knew I might count on your exactitude." "On my devotion," replied the colonel, with a bow. "Present me to your friends," continued the first, "and, when that ceremony had been performed, I wish, gentlemen," he added, with the most exquisite affability, "that I could offer you a more cheerful program. It is ungracious to inaugurate an acquaintance upon serious affairs, but the compulsion of events is stronger than the obligations of good fellowship. I hope and believe you will be able to forgive me this unpleasant evening, and for men of your stamp it will be enough to know that you are conferring a considerable favor." "Your Highness," said the Major, "must pardon my bluntness. I am unable to hide what I know. For some time back I have suspected Major Hammersmith, but Mr. Goddell is unmistakable. To seek two men in London unacquainted with Prince Florizel of Bohemia was to ask too much at fortune's hands." "Prince Florizel!" cried Brackenbury in amazement. And he gazed with the deepest interest on the features of the celebrated personage before him. "I shall not lament the loss of my incognito," remarked the prince, "for it enables me to thank you with the more authority. You would have done as much for Mr. Goddell, I feel sure, as for the Prince of Bohemia, but the latter can perhaps do more for you. The gain is mine," he added, with a courteous gesture. And the next moment he was conversing with the two officers about the Indian Army and the native troops, a subject on which, as on all others, he had a remarkable fund of information and the soundest views. There was something so striking in this man's attitude at a moment of deadly peril that Brackenbury was overcome with respectful admiration. Nor was he less sensible to the charm of his conversation or the surprising amenity of his address. Every gesture, every intonation, was not only noble in itself, but seemed to ennoble the fortunate mortal for whom it was intended. And Brackenbury confessed to himself with enthusiasm that this was a sovereign for whom a brave man might thankfully lay down his life. Many minutes had thus passed, when the person who had introduced them into the house, and who had sat ever since in a corner, and with his watch in his hand, arose and whispered a word into the prince's ear. "It is well, drive." "Noel," replied Florizel, aloud. And then addressing the others, "You will excuse me, gentlemen," he added, "if I have to leave you in the dark. The moment now approaches." Dr. Noel extinguished the lamp. A faint, grey light, premonitory of the dawn, illuminated the window, but was not sufficient to illuminate the room. And when the prince rose to his feet, it was impossible to distinguish his features or to make a guess at the nature of the emotion which obviously affected him as he spoke. He moved towards the door, and placed himself at one side of it in an attitude of the wariest attention. "You will have the kindness," he said, "to maintain the strictest silence, and to conceal yourselves in the densest of the shadow." The 3 officers and the physician hastened to obey, and for nearly 10 minutes the only sound in Rochester House was occasioned by the excursions of the rats behind the woodwork. At the end of that period, a loud creak of a hinge broke in with surprising distinctness on the silence, and shortly after, the watchers could distinguish a slow and cautious tread approaching up the kitchen stair. At every second step, the intruder seemed to pause and lend an ear, and during these intervals, which seemed of an incalculable duration, a profound disquiet possessed the spirit of the listeners. Dr. Noel, accustomed as he was to dangerous emotions, suffered an almost pitiful physical prostration. His breath whistled in his lungs, his teeth grated one upon another, and his joints cracked aloud as he nervously shifted his position. At last a hand was laid upon the door, and the bolt shot back with a slight report. There followed another pause, during which Brackenbury could see the prince draw himself together noiselessly as if for some unusual exertion. Then the door opened, letting in a little more of the light of the morning, and the figure of a man appeared upon the threshold and stood motionless. He was tall, and carried a knife in his hand. Even in the twilight they could see his upper teeth bare and glistening, for his mouth was open like that of a hound about to leap. The man had evidently been over the head in water but a minute or two before, and even while he stood there the drops kept falling from his wet clothes and pattered on the floor. The next moment he crossed the threshold. There was a leap, a stifled cry, an instantaneous struggle, and before Colonel Geraldine could spring to his aid, the prince held the man disarmed and helpless, by the shoulders. "Dr. Noel," he said, "you will be so good as to re-light the lamp." And relinquishing the charge of his prisoner to Geraldine and Brackenbury, he crossed the room and set his back against the chimney-piece. As soon as the lamp had kindled, the party beheld an unaccustomed sternness on the prince's features. It was no longer Florizel, the careless gentleman. It was the Prince of Bohemia, justly incensed and full of deadly purpose, who now raised his head and addressed the captive president of the Suicide Club. "President," he said, "you have laid your last snare, and your own feet are taken in it. The day is beginning. It is your last morning. You have just swum the Regent's Canal. It is your last bathe in this world. Your old accomplice, Drive Noel, so far from betraying me, has delivered you into my hands for judgment. And the grave you had dug for me this afternoon shall serve, in God's almighty providence, to hide your own just doom from the curiosity of mankind. Kneel and pray, sir, if you have a mind that way. For your time is short, and God is weary of your iniquities." The president made no answer either by word or sign, but continued to hang his head and gaze sullenly on the floor, as though he were conscious of the prince's prolonged and unsparing regard. "Gentlemen," continued Florizel, resuming the ordinary tone of his conversation, "this is a fellow who has long eluded me, but whom, thanks to Dr. Noel, I now have tightly by the heels. To tell the story of his misdeeds would occupy more time than we can now afford, but if the canal had contained nothing but the blood of his victims, I believe the wretch would have been no drier than you see him. Even in an affair of this sort I desire to preserve the forms of honor. But I make you the judges, gentlemen. This is more an execution than a duel, and to give the rogue his choice of weapons would be to push too far a point of etiquette. I cannot afford to lose my life in such a business, he continued, unlocking the case of swords, and as a pistol bullet travels so often on the wings of chance, and skill and courage may fall by the most trembling marksman, I have decided, and I feel sure you will approve my determination, to put this question to the touch of swords. When Brackenbury and Major O'Rourke, to whom these remarks were particularly addressed, had each intimated his approval, "Quick, sir," added Prince Florizel to the President, "choose a blade and do not keep me waiting. I have an impatience to be done with you forever." For the first time since he was captured and disarmed, the President raised his head, and it was plain that he began instantly to pluck up courage. "Is it to be stand up?" he asked eagerly, "and between you and me?" "I mean so far to honor you," replied the prince. "Oh, come," cried the President. "With a fair field, who knows how things may happen? I must add that I consider it handsome behavior on your Highness's part, and if the worst comes to the worst I shall die by one of the most gallant gentlemen in Europe." And the President, liberated by those who had detained him, stepped up to the table and began, with minute attention, to select a sword. He was highly elated, and seemed to feel no doubt that he should issue victorious from the contest. The spectators grew alarmed in the face of so entire a confidence, and adjured Prince Florizel to reconsider his intention. "It is but a farce," he answered, "and I think I can promise you, gentlemen, that it will not be long a playing." "Your Highness will be careful not to overreach," said Colonel Geraldine. "Geraldine," returned the prince, "did you ever know me fail in a debt of honor? I owe you this man's death, and you shall have it." The President at last satisfied himself with one of the rapiers, and signified his readiness by a gesture that was not devoid of a rude nobility. The nearness of peril, and the sense of courage, even to this obnoxious villain, lent an air of manhood and a certain grace. The prince helped himself at random to a sword. "Colonel Geraldine and Dr. Noel," he said, "will have the goodness to await me in this room. I wish no personal friend of mine to be involved in this transaction. Major O'Rourke, you are a man of some years and a settled reputation. Let me recommend the President to your good graces. Lieutenant Rich will be so good as lend me his attentions. A young man cannot have too much experience in such affairs." "Your Highness," replied Brackenbury, "it is an honor I shall prize extremely." "It is well," returned Prince Florizel. "I shall hope to stand your friend in more important circumstances." And so saying he led the way out of the apartment and down the kitchen stairs. The two men who were thus left alone threw open the window and leaned out, straining every sense to catch an indication of the tragical events that were about to follow. The rain was now over. Day had almost come, and the birds were piping in the shrubbery and on the forest trees of the garden. The prince and his companions were visible for a moment as they followed an alley between two flowering thickets, but at the first corner a clump of foliage intervened, and they were again concealed from view. This was all that the colonel and the physician had an opportunity to see, and the garden was so vast, and the place of combat evidently so remote from the house, that not even the noise of swordplay reached their ears. "He has taken him towards the grave," said Dr. Noel, with a shudder. "God," cried the colonel, "God defend the right." And they awaited the event in silence, the doctor shaking with fear, the colonel in an agony of sweat. Many minutes must have elapsed. The day was sensibly broader, and the birds were singing more heartily in the garden before a sound of returning footsteps recalled their glances towards the door. It was the prince and the two Indian officers who entered. God had defended the right. "I am ashamed of my emotion," said Prince Florizel. "I feel it is a weakness unworthy of my station. But the continued existence of that hound of hell had begun to prey upon me like a disease, and his death has more refreshed me than a night of slumber. Look, Geraldine," he continued, throwing his sword upon the floor. "There is the blood of the man who killed your brother. It should be a welcome sight. And yet," he added, "see how strangely we men are made. My revenge is not yet 5 minutes old, and already I am beginning to ask myself if even revenge be attainable on this precarious stage of life. The ill he did, who can undo it? The career in which he amassed a huge fortune, for the house itself in which we stand belonged to him. That career is now a part of the destiny of mankind forever. And I might weary myself making thrusts in cart until the crack of judgment, and Geraldine's brother would be none the less dead, and 1,000 other innocent persons would be none the less dishonored and debauched. The existence of a man is so small a thing to take, so mighty a thing to employ. Alas," he cried, "is there anything in life so disenchanting as attainment?" "God's justice has been done," replied the doctor. "So much I behold. The lesson, your highness, has been a cruel one for me, and I await my own turn with deadly apprehension." "What was I saying?" cried the prince. "I have punished, and here is the man beside us who can help me to undo. Ah, drive. Noel. You and I have before us many a day of hard and honorable toil, and perhaps, before we have none, you may have more than redeemed your early errors. And in the meantime," said the doctor, "let me go and bury my oldest friend." And this, observes the erudite Arabian, is the fortunate conclusion of the tale. The prince, it is superfluous to mention, forgot none of those who served him in this great exploit, and to this day his authority and influence help them forward in their public career, while his condescending friendship adds a charm to their private life. To collect, continues my author, all the strange events in which this prince has played the part of Providence were to fill the habitable globe with books. But the stories which relate to the fortunes of the Rajah's diamond are of too entertaining a description, says he, to be omitted. Following prudently in the footsteps of this Oriental, we shall now begin the series to which he refers with the story of the bandbox.
KaraokeBooks.